We don't do that here anyways. We don't do that here. Okay. Call this meeting to order. Madam Clerk, any introduction of addendum items?
No, there are none this evening.
Have a mover and a seconder to confirm the agenda. Harry, Gary, questions? All in favor? That's carried. Any disclosures of interest this evening? Seeing none. We have two delegations. We have our first delegation is Peter Van Colart and Kathy Boyko, co-chairs of the 2019 ARC Terminus Committee regarding the 2019 Air Race Classic Terminus event on June 19th to the 21st at the Niagara Central Dorothy Rungling Airport, and it's with regards to some funding. So if you want to come forward to the side, and there's a button on the speaker, just give that a press, and away you go.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, Port Colborne Council, councillors, and the folks of Port Colborne. My name is Peter Van Colart. I'm one of the co-chairs of this event, the Air Race Classic. My other co-chair has been delayed and she won't be attending this evening. I've come before you to formalize what I've put in writing earlier this month, and each of the councillors would have received a letter from both of us with respect to our event and our funding request regarding this event, as well as opportunity for ad sponsorship, and lastly, a proclamation from the city or from the town of Port Colborne to declare the week of the event Air Race Week. I have made this presentation to the other membership cities of the airport because it's one of the few joint assets that's shared by 4 municipal corporations in the Niagara region, and it is the only general aviation training airport in southern Niagara. And I've made this request to the other cities, and Port Colborne is my second to last stop here, with Welland coming up later this week. The reception I've received has been fantastic. The newspaper coverage has been good as well. I was really pleased to see the coverage last week in the Welland Tribune about this event. So the event itself is an all-women's air race. And this is an all-women's air race that is international in its scope. And it's done to foster the fellowship of the women working together as teams themselves to complete the air race. But on a larger scale, it's to point out that the aviation and aerospace sciences and industry is not a male-only dominated career choice. And this sends a very huge message to the young women in all of the communities of southern Niagara, that there is a venue, there is a way to get into aviation, and it is through the local general airport. And we're so fortunate to have a local general airport shared by the 4 communities. So 4 years ago, I was able to contact the people who organized this event and suggest to them that this would be a great place for the event to stop. And largely because it's mainly attended by Americans. There are a few people from Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere in the world who will attend. But largely because it's been American-centric since 2011, this was a very big thing for them to consider going back outside of their national borders and to make the event truly international once again. It has never ended here, but it has started here. In the past, the woman for whom the airport was named, Dorothy Rungling, was an air racer of her own accord in the 50s and 60s. Phenomenal woman who also happened to be a counselor, also happened to be an air racer and an avid pilot, as well as an instructor. She was instrumental in saving the airport in the 60s when it was going to be turned into a turnip field. And, you know, by bringing attention to the airport and the value and benefit to the community, as her namesake, I suppose she's doing it once again. The cool part about this is that I've worked out in the ask that I gave you in my letter, I've worked out the numbers that I'm looking for. And to be specific, with respect to the city of Port Colborne, we're looking for roughly around 10 cents per capita, which works out to about $1,830. I'd round that off to $2,000 just to make the accounting easier, and I wouldn't say no to the extra 170 bucks or so. We're wanting this money not to do anything more than to help us carry on with the operation costs before the event starts, because there are upfront costs that we need to find monies for. And we've had a fundraising campaign, and we've got roughly half of the money in, but we need $40,000 in total, and we've got just over $21,000 in fundraising activity. So the ask that we're asking for is, you know, quite marginal. I will want to point out that the number represents a 66 times benefit, economic benefit back to the community. And this is the part that most people are just stunned by when they hear. That means $1 that you put into this event comes back as $66 in economic impact. And I don't know too many municipal assets that have that kind of economic impact back to the community. And in a broader scale, if you look at the airport in general, the funding for the airport on an annual basis is actually quite small to the Airport Commission through each one of the 4 municipalities. And there's a formula for this. But in 2014, there was an economic impact report done by an independent third party that reported back between the period of 2014 to 2018, the economic benefit to Southern Niagara municipalities is in the area of $14 million. That's huge, considering the grant that the city puts out on an annual basis. It's a phenomenal deal. So with that, I'd like to ask the council to consider the 10 cent per capita funding request. I'd also like them to consider taking out a quarter-page ad in the glossy magazine that's like the magazine that I passed out this evening to the councillors. And I'd also like you to consider declaring the time between June 19th and 24th Air Race Week in the city of Port Colborne. Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Peter. As far as the proclamation goes, that is coming to council on our January 28th meeting, so that's already done. As far as the ask for the dollars, I believe somebody spoke to Nancy Giles in my office with regards to our granting program we have in the city, which this would be eligible for. So I would make sure before the end of the month, I think it's the end of the month.
It's the end of the month.
End of the month that comes through, that you get that application in and let our committee go through that and let you know.
I have a comment about that. In reading through the policy regarding that granting request, I believe the organization that I'm working with will not qualify. And if somebody can point out my concerns as to where we can qualify, I'd be happy to submit that request.
Peter? Okay, we can get you in touch with Mr. Sinez with regards to that. Perfect. And then kind of tie that up with regards to whether you do qualify or not.
Thank you very
much.
much.
All right, Peter? Okay. Any questions to the speaker? No? Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
You too.
See you Air Race Week.
Yes. Our next delegation is Mariam Madia, Vice President Finance, Administration and IT, YMCA of Niagara, and Kathy Ann White of the YMCA regarding a request for funding.
Good evening, Mayor Steele, council members, City of Port Colborne staff, and members of the public. My name's Kathy Ann White, and I'm the Vice President of Health, Fitness, and Aquatics for the YMCA's of Niagara and Oakville. And I'm pleased to be here this evening to review our 6-year highlights for your Port Colborne YMCA and share with you a little bit about what's new for 2018 and 19. And with me this evening is Mario Medea, who is our Vice President of Finance, Administration, and IT, and Catherine Clark, who's our Director of Membership at our YMCA Port Colborne. I'm going to try to offer you a couple of highlights from our 2017-2018 report. Talk, as I say, about a couple of new things we're introducing this year. And Mario is going to provide you with a review of the financial results for the period 2013 to 17, the first 5 years of our partnership agreement. Talk to you a little bit about the impact of Bill 148 in our last year and this, and talk to you about our projections, financial projections going forward for the next 6 years. Our Port Colborne YMCA celebrates the leadership and development of more than 75 staff. More than 1,200 volunteer hours annually, donated by more than 50 volunteers, and last year served an average of about 2,300 members on roll throughout the year. This number has been relatively consistent over the past several years. 400 children, youth, individuals, families supported through financial assistance. It's about 18% of our members on roll, and in fact, we're deliberately trying to grow our financially assisted categories. We've engaged more than 460 children and youth continuously in swim lessons and other skill-based sports, and partnered with more than 22 community organizations and provided 1,640 days of camp. Continuing to participate in a number of community events, and we're delighted to do so, everything from Canal Days to Canada Day to Santa Claus parades, Valley Day, New Year's Eve, and coming up soon, Family Day weekend. This past year, we launched a few new adult programs, YMCA Bar, expanded our yoga and Zumba classes, and I'd encourage you to come out and try them if you haven't, and pickleball, which is on fire here in Port Colborne. It's a big pickleball town. We've relaunched personal training, small group training, and our new member orientations, trying to make sure that people who join get started off on the right foot and adopt a healthy lifestyle. We've revised and refreshed our approach to marketing, communication, new member incentives, and we've introduced more skill-based programming for children. And just now, in the process of launching a program called Jairus Dance. This is in partnership with the Jairus Center for Aging Research at Hamilton Health Sciences. This program is an intervention for people suffering with both cognitive and physical impairments and uses dance, movement, repetition, and rhythm to help them reacquire skills. Financial assistance is an important part of our charitable purpose. As I mentioned, we currently financially assist about 18% of our members, and this year we changed the way that we provide financial assistance in an effort to make it easier to apply. So now, if somebody is unable to afford the fees, they simply present a tax assessment, and we evaluate their ability to pay based on their income and reconcile against local poverty rates. This is our January promotion right now. If you join this month, pay no join fee. And we're finding that some of these outreach incentives are generating new leads and new members for our YMCA. And coming up shortly in February, we'll be running our biggest fundraiser of the year, our Move event. Move for Small Kids this year is a superhero theme, and I'd be delighted to engage anyone as a superhero in one of our super events. This is the fun part.
Thank you, Kathy Ann, and good evening, Mayor Steele, City Councilors, and City of Port Colborne staff. I'm here to walk you through the financials of our operations at the Valley Center. All financials on a year basis will be the period September to August, as our fiscal year is August 31st. We had presented to Council this past November, so for those councilors who were present, some of these slides are repetitive, but they're still relevant to our projections going forward. This first slide is a recap of the first 5 years of our partnership. And the intent of this agreement when it was first started was not to create any financial hardship for the City of Port Colborne or the YMCA. And I'm happy to say, if you look at the net number at the bottom, we've achieved that in the first 5 years of the operation. Yeah, go ahead. However, as we started the second 5-year cycle, all YMCAs in Ontario were significantly impacted by Bill 148 with the increase on wages. As a leading employer of youth, our compensation expenses substantially increased. This slide shows the impact in the first year of implementation of Bill 148 and for 8 months at the Valley Center. And as you can see, the impact was $56,000. And I just want to point out, this is like an 8-month period. So if over a 12-month period, it's about $84,000 impact on our operations. This next slide is the next 5 years, which includes the current fiscal year we're in. And I've added 1 year at the end, and I'll explain why. So you can see that deficit of $56,000 impacted the first year. So we had ended up with a deficit of about $46,000. And the City of Port Colborne provided additional funding of about $22,000, which we are very grateful for. In the current fiscal year, 2018-19, our original projection was a deficit of $75,000, but we've taken steps to reduce that, and those are in the 3 areas highlighted in yellow where we've deferred expenses. The most significant one is in the area of deferred capital depreciation, where we've revised our capital forecast from $30,000 down to $10,000. So we're showing a deficit in this current fiscal year of about $49,000. As you project forward, you can see the deficit is improving. And when you get to year 6, I've added that one there because there's a significant item that drops off in that year. In June of 2023, the financing component, which is included under the heading of deferred capital depreciation, is eliminated. It's eliminated in June, so it's there for 10 months of the year. But that represents about $125,000 to $135,000 over this period. So when we get to that point, we expect surpluses, and at that point, we would be able to return funds to the City of Port Colborne. So in summary, we have a continued focus on improving HFA programs. We're focused on membership retention. The first 5 years were successful in service delivery and financially. Bill 148 had a dramatic increase in our cost at Port Colborne specifically. YMCA Niagara is grateful for our partnership, and we're pleased to serve the citizens of Port Colborne. And we ask for this current fiscal year for the city to set aside approximately 50% of our projected deficit in an amount of approximately $25,000. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? You don't have to stand because it's just a budget meeting, guys. Gary?
Thank you for the presentation. On the elimination of the capital depreciation, is that with respect to your initial capital outlay that you funded fitness room and things that you put in?
That was for the initial investment in setting up the building. It was $1.1 million, and that's being amortized over a 10-year period.
Okay. Just subsequent to that then, by the time you get to 2022-23,
yes.
Will you not be doing any annual injections of capital, replace equipment, or add new things?
We are. In that figure is, except for the current year, there's about $30,000 of ongoing capital included in that figure beyond 2018-19.
Okay. Okay. And if I could just on the 80-odd thousand impacted by the minimum wage increase.
Yes.
It seems like you've, sorry, 55,000, right?
Yes, yes, 56 for last year.
Sorry, 56. It seems like on your projected revenues for 218, 219, you're expecting that to increase by 52,000 from 1,225,000 to 1,277,000. So is
Yes.
that a result of membership and fees, or just fees, or both? And could you give me a
There's
breakdown?
There's a price increase, and I'll let Kathy Ann comment as well. There's a price increase included in that, and our plan is going forward to, try and implement a price increase. It's by category, so we'll be sensitive to the categories where that doesn't make sense.
Okay.
But that's a combination of price increase and other revenue from new programs.
It's a combination of recognizing that our members on roll, we may see modest growth, but we will anticipate to derive slightly better revenue per member through the combination of annual increases, modest annual increases, the expansion of some categories that are underrepresented in our membership, including assisted members,
Right.
and the introduction of some additional revenue lines, such as personal training, small group personal training, some of the fee-based programs that we know elements of the community would like to see and are willing to pay for, that improve the overall revenue performance.
Right. Thank you. I'm encouraged by the fact that you're trying to make up for that one-time jolt, a loss, and I feel for you in that that you've had a one-time impact. Some of the concern has been that I don't know if there was enough time to react, but certainly that was telegraphed by the province at the time. So I don't know if that caught you mid-cycle, or I assume your membership is renewing over 12 months, so there was some time you had to react.
It's a continuous membership model, so it's not really an annual.
Right.
Yeah, it's just an ongoing.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly keen on supporting the Y. I think you've done a fabulous job since you've been here. I find it amazing, I've been told, that I think it's a testament to the citizens of Port Colborne, but, for a community our size to have a Y, and I would suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have heard that if you divide, notwithstanding you'll have people from Waynfleet and Ridgeway coming and otherwise, but basically if you look at our population divided by how many members you have, I would think it's probably got the best take-up rate in Niagara, surpassing St. Catharines, Niagara Falls. Would that be fair to say?
I would think so.
It's
Yeah.
very healthy representation
Yes.
of the community, yes.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Anybody else? Eric?
So on the slide where it says impact of Bill 148 minimum wage,
Yes?
can you clarify what you mean by other bands impacted?
Yeah, at the November presentation, I did a slide on the impact of Bill 148. I mean, you have the minimum wage going from $11.60 to $14. That's the obvious impact. That's the first line. But if you just think about it, if you have someone making $13.90 before, and the people who were at $11.60 before jumping up over them, it's those bands that were impacted by the compression. So we had to not only raise the minimum wage, we had to raise others in a certain band that were impacted by that increase.
And that you had to do that?
Well, it only made, well, we had to get to $14 for everyone regardless, but it wouldn't have been good for our staff had we had not.
It's a bit about
done that.
internal equity.
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other questions? No? Peter, anything to add?
Sort of in behind the monitor. No, I think we've had meetings, regular meetings with the YMCA over the years, and we go over their financials, and we actually sit down and try to encourage the YMCA and with ourselves, as to what other types of revenues and things that would be beneficial for both the YMCA and for the city of Port Colborne to try to ensure that the revenues are there and that our contributions towards the YMCA continue, and that we try to minimize any additional further impact to the city. And with this particular situation, we talked about the wage impact, and it didn't just affect the YMCA, it affected the city as a whole also, because we had the same thing happen with the city with regard to the wage increases, and we had to account for those also. So it's across the board. And I think that the continuation and the relationship that we have had and the growth that the YMCA has, I think the community is getting a good bang for the buck that we are actually investing in the YMCA.
Okay, thank you. Gary.
Just if I could, Mr. Mayor, one additional question. You've shown us your projections going forward, and it's admirable that you're phasing in without jolting the membership to recover. What kind of assurances can you give that if those projections aren't on track? So in other words, it's I'm really asking the question for the next years going forward. And notwithstanding you can't predict unforeseen circumstances, but is it your position that if you do better, that future subsidy could even be less than what you're projecting?
Yes, it is. And in the first 5 years, we actually have done that. There were 2 years where we've returned funds to the city, and we monitor our results monthly. And if we see a significant change, we would meet with the city and just see how that would go.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Anything else? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So we have 2 items this evening. One is item number 1. I'm going to ask for a mover and a seconder to memorandum from Peter Sinez, Director of Corporate Services, regarding storm sewer management fees considerations in 2019 draft budget. And then we'll have Peter present that, and then we'll go to questions and then move on to item 2. So can I just get a mover and a seconder? Councillor Desmarais, Councillor Wells. Peter, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The memo that you have in front of you, it's with regard to storm sewer management fees, and what it entails is a funding strategy for creating a storm sewer utility budget, which means taking the storm sewer operations out of the general operations levy and creating a utility for the storm sewer. And the reason for that being is that there never has been a stable source of funding for storm sewer, especially on the capital side, for storm sewers themselves. And in 2014, there was an infrastructure needs study that was done within the urban storm sewer drainage boundary. And the recommendations for funding for the storm sewer were developed out of that. We've looked at, from the staff perspective, we looked at what the recommendations were back then and the fee structure, and we've basically adjusted the fee structure from the original proposal that the council had seen at that time. And the councillors who were here at that time would have seen some higher fees in that projection. So we were able to tweak that, and you'll see that in my presentation later on this evening. The one thing that should be noted is that this particular utility fund is definitely separate and distinct from the city's ditching program. The ditching program is in the general fund, and it is a different type of program. And it's also different from the rural drains maintenance program, which is one that gets billed back to the adjoining landowners in the rural area. We did have a strategic planning session, and that was provided in your budget package back in 2015. And also in your package, we provided a Environmental Commissioner of Ontario document that was titled Urban Stormwater Fees and How to Pay for What You Need. And basically what it's saying is that most municipalities now are moving towards a utility billing system and a flat fee system of creating funding for both operations and for capital purposes, and for continued maintenance, preventive maintenance programs. So what you'll see that we're recommending is that a separate storm sewer budget be implemented in 2019 by removing the operating maintenance budget, which is about $885,000 out of the tax levy in the general fund, and that we create a new revenue source through a storm sewer flat fee for this area. The general annual revenue would be approximately $740,000, and that would sustain for funding for operations. The current debenture, as you know, we did the Nickel area storm sewer over the last couple of years, and the debenture on that is $300,000 annually. So we'll also pay for that. In addition to that, it'll create an ongoing fund for future capital storm sewer projects. And you'll see that in some of the slides that I'm going to show you this evening. The annual residential fee that we're proposing is $100 to every property owner for in residential. In multi-res, the multi-res and commercial fee would range from $175 to $275 depending on the size of the commercial entity. And that would be the same for industrial properties, and would range either from $375 to $475 annually, and that's an annual amount. So therefore there's a tiered structure if you're a small commercial business versus a large commercial business, or light industrial versus heavy industrial. What I'll bring to your attention is the fact that we could, easily levy $740,000 on our general levy to create the funding for this program. But in doing so, what happens is you have an unfair distribution of who pays for what. So with a flat fee of $100, a residential property, it'd be very different if an assessed house of $185,000 versus an assessed house of $1 million is going to be, if it's on the tax levy, it's going to be paid based on the tax ratios and the tax rate. So a $1 million house is going to pay considerably more than $100 versus somebody that's in a smaller house, it's assessed house that's paying $100. They may be, some properties may be the exact same size, but the assessment is different, some higher than others. So it wouldn't be as fair and equitable in that case. And the difference between raising the funding through the tax levy and the flat fee is about $16. And I'll show you that in the slides that I have coming up. Many municipalities are funding their storm sewer budgets through this method of funding. And with most municipalities, the average for a residential is about $100. And a lot of these municipalities, especially large municipalities, have gone through a large component of determining how much, what's the word for it, on the impermeable. Yeah, impermeable surface. Yes, impermeable surface. So where the rainwater either gets absorbed in or it gets run off. And so there's a lot of calculations that a lot of large municipalities have gone through to create and come up with this wonderful funding formula, all to come up with almost the same number of $100 for the average residential homeowner. So basically what we're doing is we've sort of waited to see how these were coming out with other municipalities, and we put our program in place without having to go through the administration cost of determining these formulas and so on, and then having to maintain these formulas. And basically the large municipalities had to hire staff in order to maintain these formulas. So we've been able to look at it differently and look at it from higher up level and come up with a tiered solution and come up with the same values as most municipalities are using. With that said, what this method does is provides a dedicated and stable source of funding for long-range planning, preventive maintenance, and capital improvements. And it's a fair and equitable way to distribute the cost. As I've mentioned, the flat fee is not dependent on assessment of a property, and which would vary from property to property and wouldn't be fair and equitable to them. that basically covers sort of where we are at, and basically why this is brought forward separately is because this is a public meeting. The budget is a public meeting. It's open to the public, and if any public had any concerns or questions, then they could come forward. I'm not sure if there's anybody here that's to speak to this particular subject, but if not, then I would get into more detail when we get into the presentation. I'm not sure if Chris has anything else that he may want to add, Mr. Mayor.
Through you to Mayor and the rest of Council. Essentially, Peter has summed it up quite well. There's been a great deal of time and research on the part of staff from multiple departments in this particular endeavor. And as Peter had said previously, a lot of the larger municipalities in Ontario have actually created large bureaucracies to try and control and wrestle this idea to the ground. We've tried to avoid that and tried to control our costs, and ironically, in examining all of those, as Peter had indicated, we ended up with almost identical numbers without creating the bureaucracy to control it. So that's sort of the way we've tried to control the process going forward.
Okay, John, thank you. Questions? Gary?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Snez and Mr. Lee. I have to commend staff for coming up with this. When I first looked at that memo, I always thought when a storm sewer levy was going to come about, it would be more than $100 given the vast amount of area in Port Colborne and the urban service area that doesn't have storm sewers, let alone the maintenance and repair of the same. Particularly like the fact that it's equitable. It doesn't depend on how much frontage you have, how the value of your house. We all contribute to that. But having said that, I think it's important to raise that my assumption would be, correct me if I'm wrong, that this $100 levy on the residential side will be borne by all the houses either in the urban service area or with water and wastewater. And so that will include people who will pay this who may not see a storm sewer for a few years, but obviously this is the way to get to that. I just think that when people start paying that and saying, what am I getting for it? In some cases it's going to be a storm sewer, hopefully in this year out. So I just want the members of the public and for council that it's understood that they'll be paying a storm sewer levy without a storm sewer for a while.
Peter? Chris?
With you, Mr. Mayor, and the rest of council. That is basically it in a nutshell. You're absolutely right. With the amounts that we have set within this budget process here, we're trying not to come up with $1 million revenue scenario. We're trying to keep these dollars under control. As Peter had indicated before, some of the dollars will be spent on maintenance of existing systems, of which some of them are in dire need of replacement or some sort of repair. And then any of the other funds available, we can look at using those for debentures to move them forward. Staff will be bringing forward recommendations on where the next projects should be, the timing, sequencing of all that. And then that'll all be part of the annual budget discussions with this revenue in a reserve that we can then fall back on to decide how and what council would like to do with it.
Thank you.
As well, so the $185,425, effectively, this is a draft budget, will be taken from the levy and enveloped into the storm sewer fund. So in the current budget, is there assumption for this being passed and the 185 already taken out, or is it presented with it in, and if we vote in this program, that opens up that either tax room or dollar amount?
Peter?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, the budget has been prepared based on the recommendation that our recommendation is that council would approve going forward with the storm sewer budget with the $185,000 out of the general levy and it being part of the storm sewer budget going forward.
Okay. And then finally, Mr. Mayor, I'm sure it'll be of interest to people who pay commercial taxation. You talked about the $100 flat fee for residential, but a different rate for those in the commercial area. Can you speak to any thoughts on how that will be calculated?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Bruno. Specifically to the calculation on it, a lot of it is based on a determination of the runoff. A lot of the commercial properties have hard surfaces, so their runoff coefficients, so the amount of runoff / rainwater / storm event would be contributing more to that storm sewer system and subsequently would require more use of that storm sewer system today, tomorrow, and into the future. So with those numbers that we've generated through a number of calculations, also trying not to heavily load the commercial and especially the heavy industrial side, because some of those have controls within their system and then they have a controlled runoff. And they've taken those considerations into the development of the sites. So the numbers that you see are based on that, and ironically, in some, as Peter had indicated earlier, in some of the larger municipalities where this bureaucracy was set up to do these calculations, where they actually take into account, say a residence has an addition, well now all of a sudden the runoff coefficient on that larger home, because a roof has almost instantaneous runoff. So they're doing those finite calculations and changing people's assessments by $2.85 every year, or whatever the number works out to. Well, we're trying to avoid that process and the controlling of it. The statement was once made, why spend $1 to do 5 cents worth of work? So we're trying to keep that in mind.
Thanks, Councillor. Any other questions? Yes, Don?
Mr. Mayor, to Chris, I guess, to answer this.
Oh, your microphone?
That would help. So if you're talking about a flat fee, so I'm assuming then that this would come on the tax bill and it would be separated out as a flat fee added to the yearly taxes? Is that how it would be billed?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Kalita. Yes, that's the way it's going to be set up in the billing process. So it would be very similar to, as Peter had said, it's a fund separate, so it'll be very much like the water and sewer funds. So it'll be a separate line on the tax billing, which will have the flat fee on it.
So will they see that their taxes have gone down by that proportion to be able to recognize that they're not paying that much more? Like, I'm just worried about the perception that people are going to see their taxes, which are still probably going up minimally, and then on top of that, they're going to see another line saying we're now paying for this as well. Is there a way to get around this, Peter?
Peter?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, there's two ways that we can bill it out. One is either on the water bill, and the other option is on the tax bill. And it's definitely going to be shown as a separate line item, and there's an education process that, you know, we'd have to get out to the public and the ratepayers as to why we're doing this and what it is. So, you know, they'll always say it's another tax, but in essence, what it is creating a stable funding source for doing storm sewer work that really has lacked in every municipality in Ontario, and eventually it's at the ministry level, and eventually it's going to be mandated that we're going to have to do something no different than water and wastewater. So it's becoming that more prominent, and so we're going to try to get ahead of the game and create that funding, and we're just going to have to educate ratepayers that this is a specific fund. For storm sewers in the future and within the certain area. As you know, even for the Ward 4 councillors, the $185,000 that's in for the storm sewer, the rural area residents are paying for that through their tax levy, and essentially that'll be coming off, so they don't have to pay for that part of the storm sewer project. It's going to be the properties that are within that area that are actually paying for the system, where residents in the Ward 4 and in the rural area, they're already paying for the programs for drainage, and so they're not going to have to pay twice type of thing and pay for what's happening within the urban area. So it's an education process that we'll definitely have to do, and I think that it will definitely be a line item. We'll have to highlight it and explain it so that it's not with regard to or equivalent to anything with regard on your property tax based on assessment. It's based on a flat amount for a specific purpose.
Thank you. I totally agree with what you're saying. I understand the need for it. I spent the weekend trying to understand it all, but I just know that people will ask that question. Well, we haven't seen our taxes go down, but we're seeing another 100 go on it. But I think if we can put an educational component or maybe something, explanation along with it to try to help us out when we're getting those calls as to why.
The key part to it too is that we're looking at raising $740,000 annually. Obviously, there'll be cost of living increases over the next years. Basically, if we wanted to create that fund and start it for storm sewer, and we levied that on the tax levy of $740,000, the taxes on a number of properties within the community would see a huge increase based on the levy. So this way, at least, it levels it out throughout the community, that you're paying $100 versus some may pay $300 or $400 based on their assessment if we put it on the tax levy. And I think that's what has to be really put out there in the education process as to why and how that's working.
And I think anyone who came to your presentation and saw that the condition of the pipes understands that we do need to do it.
Yeah, true.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Demery.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Peter. Peter, I'm really happy to see that you're doing it this way, and I'm really glad to see that it's being done this $100 flat fee rather than a local improvement sort of thing, which, again, would be really costly for the taxpayer. But it is going to be a difficult thing to sell to some people. And I mean, I'm thinking in particular Wellington Street and 40 years of burning out sump pumps. Those people understand the need for storm sewers, but they need to know that something like this might actually fast track them to getting those storm sewers. And that's my question. Does it have the ability to really do that? Is there a realistic fast tracking going on here?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Demery. That is the intent. In creating this reserve, so to speak, then that allows us to bring forward projects to council to have them debate and discuss based on our recommendations, and then moving forward, we can pick those areas where we have problems, where there have been inherent problems for a number of years, and then we can then, from that point in time, follow through and actually build those systems that we haven't been able to because of the initial financial commitment involved.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Mayor? And in addition to that, what you'll see in my slide presentation once I get into the budget part of it, there's a couple slides that specifically for storm sewer shows over the next 10 years how much money we're able to accumulate, where it's being spent, and how much is going to capital, and a potential debenture in there to do another $5-6 million worth of work.
Great, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Chris, in the past, we looked at like the woods in Ward 1, the Silver Street area in Ward 3, Humboldt, Wellington, and Ward 2, back a number of years ago. And at that time, I remember it was going to be around, ballpark in those days, around $6 million per project. Is that, obviously those numbers have gone up since then, but that's the kind of numbers you're talking about in those three areas that were looked at that time of being kind of that worst first scenario.
To you, Mayor, that's correct. Those were the numbers back then, and you are absolutely correct. Some of those numbers have doubled since then.
Yeah. So you're looking at big bucks. And also just through what Councillor Demery brought forward, it does put us in a position that if any infrastructure money comes forward where this is a program that may fit, it can help us to be ready to go. So I do applaud staff on that. Councillor Baggett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Demery brought up one point I had about the drainage for some of the streets that don't have them. I think it's Clare Avenue, which I was surprised doesn't have one when I was campaigning, and some of the alleys, the tugboat lanes and et cetera, experience garage flooding and that. So maybe this would eventually help pay for that. And the other question I got here is, in your package you gave us, you talked about sump pump redirects. And you give us examples on different streets. Has all that been taken care of?
Chris?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Bagu. Depending on the area, an example of that I would like to reference first off is the Omer area, where we've gone in. We had leveraged CSO funding from the region to do the sump pump disconnects. But what happened was in that process, we found out that the storm sewer system could not handle those 180 some odd redirects. So subsequently, they are not fully connected in, even though the funding has been there, we haven't spent all those dollars. And this fund would allow us to go into those areas that have had that over time, and depending on how we phase it and how council leads us that way. But that would allow us then to provide outlets and storm sewers in the areas where they're either deficient or have failed, something that was built in the 20s and needs to be refurbished. So that's the intent of this.
Okay, thank you,
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councilor Bruno.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Peter, you had me until you started talking about the ditching and taking that off the levy. So to my earlier point, so the levy is going to apply to everyone in the urban service area? Or sorry, I'm sorry, the fund, the $100 basic.
Yeah. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, there's a specific area that's defined as the urban storm sewer drainage area boundary. And that is the area that those properties within that area would be charged the $100 or the commercial, industrial, whatever the rate may be. That would be the only properties that would be designated and be charged those fees. The only thing what we're taking out of the levy, the general levy, is the maintenance costs of storm sewers themselves. So $185,000. Ditching is a separate program and is in the general levy for ditching throughout
That's
the
what
city.
I want to clarify. I thought for a while you were saying that that's coming off for the Ward 4 residents. Got it. I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Any other questions? Councillor Wells.
To you, Mayor. Deal to Chris Lee.
Yeah, your button. Thanks.
Sorry. Chris, are there any properties that are impacted by both?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Wells. Yes, there is. An example of that would be all of the urban areas that drain into the Eagle Marsh Municipal Drain. In the drainage report, it will address those, and then the contribution that area would have made under the drainage report would simply come from this levy that has already been paid into on an annual basis. So instead of the report addressing every home within that whole area would have a combined contribution, and then we would simply dip into this reserve to pay their contribution of any municipal drain works. Another one is the Central Park drain on the east side, which is the Wellington-Humboldt area. So when that new drain report comes forward, in however many years it takes to do that process, as you all know, sometimes it can be short, most of the time it's not. But that being said, then we would simply, when it came about and the report dictated that X number of dollars from that drainage watershed was contributed by that urban area, we would simply go to this reserve fund and pay that because they had already paid ahead of time.
Councillor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anything to add, staff?
Just if there's any public there.
Any public wants to speak on this issue? Okay, since there's nobody from the public, I'll allow you to go. No, Councillor, yes.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Chris Lee. When I was campaigning and I was going down Clark Street, Humboldt Street, Wellington, there was a lot of people who were upset with the drainage system there, as well as a lot of flooding in people's basements. Would having the storm sewer system and this funding help those people with those issues?
Chris?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Beauregard. The storm sewer systems will aid in that process. It will not fix a basement that leaks, but it will give the individuals who have surface flooding and sump pumps they will now have a dedicated discharge once that storm sewer system is built with the aid of this program. So in essence, it should alleviate their problems if the pipes they connect up to are correct, their sump pumps are working, if they have a problem. Some of them don't, but it would help to alleviate that issue.
And Councillor, this certainly is a step in the right direction. Although I represented Ward 1 for 17 years, it was an issue that came up every single term, and many of the councillors that were at this table. And like you now, in this past election now, having to go through the whole community, you do touch base with all those people that have gone through a lot of that work. Now, speaking of that area, there is a smaller plan to help alleviate some things with the current stormwater system that kind of runs through there. Is there any, what's our horizon for that maybe being brought forward? Chris?
To you, Mr. Mayor, actually, that would be probably one of the first ones we bring forward, because that would be the least costly. I'll say it there. It's definitely not cheap, but it'll be the least costly with probably the best return on the dollar. You and I had actually had discussions earlier on the ins and outs of that process, and that would be something that we would bring forward at the staff level to council with a report. Once a fund like this is established, then we can then reference back that in the report and say, we'd like to do this and this. We'd like to use these dollars in a debenture for X number of years, whatever the situation may be, and then make those things happen.
Yeah. So I do say to the two Ward 2 councillors, talk to Chris on that. Bring yourselves up to speed with regards to what they have planned, because it'll be a big impact on a short-term basis. It'll help alleviate a lot of the problems over there. It won't fix every problem, but it'll certainly start to, see some light at the end of the tunnel for that area. Okay, thank you. Anything else, staff? Seeing none, we have a mover and a seconder. Councillor Desmarais moved, seconded by Councillor Wells. All those in favor? Receiving the report. That's carried. Thank you. The second one will move the same way as the overview of the 2019 draft budget. I'll ask for a mover and a seconder. Councillor Desmarais, Councillor Beauregard. So Peter will go through this in our pre-budget meeting today. I think we'll have Peter go through, and as he's kind of going through sections, if you do have questions, just throw up your hands, as opposed to saving them all to the end. But Peter will kind of lead us through this. You'll get better next year for the new councillors, but Peter does a great job the way he has presented his budgets in the past. It's good education for all of us, believe me, because we've all gone through this. So as he goes through, so tonight basically is Peter's summary of this whole process. Wednesday we'll start making decisions with regards to line by lines or however you want to do things. So Peter will bring you through this. So once we go through it, we won't be making any decisions this evening. We'll accept this report and then come back on Wednesday. And then if you have more questions between now and then, you can approach Peter or bring them to our Wednesday meeting. So Peter, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So as Mayor Steele mentioned, we're not going to be looking at making any decisions at all tonight. I'm going to give you an overview through my presentation, which will cover majority of the items that are in your binder. Obviously, there's a lot more detail in your binder, but the overview will cover a majority of everything that you've seen in your binder for the budget. Before I get started, though, you will have received two packages on your desk. One is the actual budget presentation that I'm going to go through this evening, so if you want to make notes on it and whatever, that's there for you to follow along. The second package I have for you is some additional information. So if you look at this package here, which starts with the department summary, and I've put page numbers on them. So what you can do is insert them into your binder in the page order that I've given you. Some of the pages, and I'll go through them quickly here. The department summary, basically what that is a comparison between last year's budget and this year's budget and the change that's taken place by department and by section within each department. So you'll see percentages as to how much percent of the overall operating budget is administration, how much is fire services, what the percentages of engineering, and so on. So that gives you an idea of where the money is spent within each department. So, and it also shows, that takes you to gross expenditures. It also shows you allocations to and from capital and from reserves. And then at the bottom of the second page, it shows all of our revenues. and the taxation, payments in lieu, grants, and so on. So it gives you a good summary of the budget. You've seen the summary of the budget by department in the back of your binder, and by activity, and then the detailed budget. And this just summarizes it based on department and functions within the department and to the net levy that we're proposing this night. So that's the first page there, to page 2A and 2B. Page 3, you'll see page 3 and 4, and I've put a stamp on the top of it that says revised. So that is actually replacing the same pages in your original binder that you received. So, and the reason for it is I've had a couple changes since the binder had been put together and sent out to council. So for example, page 3, the revised page 3, we've added one line which is customer service part-time staffing of $34,000, $68,000 over 2 years. So that's been highlighted. The change has been highlighted on your revised sheet, and you can put that in your binder under the same page numbers, 3 and 4. I've also given you a page 6A. You'll see in your binder that there's a page 6, and this 6A is providing a different option of council, and I will go through that with you in my presentation with regard to funding of the Operations Center debt for 2019. So that's an additional page. Then you'll see page 38, 39 is the capital, and they're noted as revised. And you'll see a number of items that are highlighted. And the reason for that is some of them are saying updated cost. I received updated costs from the department, so I've updated it in the on the worksheet so that when we look at this Wednesday or the next meeting, you have the updated figures. The other item on the first page of that is at City Hall, which is a customer service renovations, and that was added to the, and we'll get into that and go through that when we get into the detail of the budget. So those are just a couple more replacements. The next 2 pages, which is 39A and B, you can put those in your binder under page 39, and basically, I'm providing a couple options to council for the capital funding for the self-contained breathing apparatus, or the SCBA, for the fire department, and also for, which is in 2020. It's a 2020 expenditure. What I like to do is think ahead of how we may fund them, and so I'm providing a couple options for council in there, and we'll go through those. And also for the fire engine number 2, which is a 2021-2022 expenditure, I have the funding formula for that also. So that's 39A and 39B, and we'll go through those. And then the last part is from page 139 to 149. That's just, again, revised. It's replacing that memo which came from Mr. Hoopinen, and that's on the one sheet that had all the yellow changes, updated costs. This package, or this memo, is just the updated numbers that are in his memo for those particular pages, so it's a revision. And the last page is 303A, which is the, I just received the Downtown Development Board Business and Improvement Area, their budget, and I've added that in. And because we have the Main Street budget, and this is 303A, which is then the Downtown Board budget. So if you can input or put those in your binders, and then when we look at them, and when we come through those, when we get into the detail, you have updated an updated package. Any questions on those? None? Okay.
You're all set.
All right. So we'll start with the 2019 operating capital budget. So the agenda for this evening is a number of items that we're going to go through. I'm going to look at what our sources of revenue are, and especially for a lot of the new councilors, I think some of this information will be relevant in getting you sort of understanding, you know, how we operate and how we fund things. So the sources of revenue we'll look at. I'll do a go over the operating levy summary, which is in your binder, but I'll go through it in a summary note. We'll go over the estimated average residential property tax and the comparisons. We'll look at blended tax summary, which is going to be quick because we don't know what the region and the education rates are just yet. We will look at unfinanced requests and funding, and that will be one area that we're going to be really jumping into on Wednesday when we get into the detail, and that's where the decision making of council will take place. Storm sewer funding and budget. We had a good discussion about it this evening, and I've got about 4 slides to go over that and show council what our concepts are. Capital funds. I'll go through what capital funds we do have available, and also what the capital levy projects and the funding that we have for those projects. So what I normally do is we have a capital levy, we have X number of dollars, and what we go through as a staff is we go through all of those capital requests, and I will, with the departments, we will fund them, whether it's from the capital levy or from reserves or from grants and so on, and we'll go through that in detail when we get into the detailed budget of the capital. I will go over some of our debt, maturing debt, and what we have in debt reserves and how we're using them. We will look at funding projects from matured debts. We have a lot of debt that has matured. We keep, what's very important, and I think for council to understand, is that when we do debenture, it's in the levy, and when that debenture matures and we don't have to pay that anymore, we keep it in our levy. And the reason we keep it in the levy is because we're always looking at projects that we're going to have to debenture in the future. And whether we use those funds that are still sitting in the levy, we have them for future projects, and we don't have to levy for it again. So if we took it out of the levy this year, yeah, it would be great. We can reduce the levy down, and it'll all look good. But then 2 years from now, when we have to debenture something, now we have to levy it back on again. So once we have it in the levy, we put it into reserve for capital projects. And when a debenture project comes up that we have to issue debt, we already have the money to pay for that debt, and we don't have to levy again to the ratepayers. So I'll give you a current debt update, where we stand with regard to our debt position, and then I'll talk about a couple potential future debenture projects. So sources of revenue. Obviously, tax levy is our main source of revenue. It encompasses about 71% of our revenues, both operating and capital, and covers our general operating expenses, and it covers a lot of our capital projects. User fees is the second. We about $2.5 million we do collect in user fees, and that's anything from renting ice, to renting out Roselawn, to the marina, all those types of user fees, planning fees, bylaw fees, that type of thing. So we recoup our costs in a number of ways. The Ontario Municipal Partnership Funds, this is the provincial funding. It's to be determined. We have not received any inclination that it's going to be anytime soon that the province is going to tell us what we're getting, what every municipality in Ontario is getting. With regard to municipal partnership funds, a lot of municipalities are anticipating maybe about a 15% cut, but we don't know. We don't know if the province is looking at small municipalities versus large municipalities. So until we actually receive what our funding is, that's going to have an impact on our budget. So we're going to continue with our budget. We're going to determine what our tax levy is, what we need to operate, and if the province comes down and says we're cutting your budget by X number of dollars, then we're going to have to deal with it at that time. And you'll see in the presentations that out of the roughly $8 million that we do get from the province, about $2.4 million is on the levy, and the other $400 and some thousand is set aside for one-time expenditures. And the reason for that over the years is that whenever they gave us additional funds over and beyond the 2.4 million that was in the levy, we didn't put it against the levy to reduce the taxes because we knew at some point in time the province is going to start cutting that back. And if they start cutting it back, it's going to raise taxes. So unless the reduction is greater than and cuts into the amount of money that we actually have in our levy, then we'll have to deal with that at the time, and that may end up increasing taxes if it means that the province is giving us less money. So that's to be determined. The Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund, there's two types of funding from that particular program. One is a formula funding, which is an amount that we get annually, and we get about $400,000 right now. The other is an application-based program, of which we applied for this year for the downtown CIP, and that particular program you have to apply, and you get up to with the combination of the formula funding and the application up to $2 million maximum. So if we get 500,000 and we only get 1.7 million or 5 million in the grant program, up to 2 million, and you can only apply for that every 2 years. So we've applied for that this year, and hoping to hear sometime this month that we've been approved for that particular grant for the downtown CIP. There's other federal and provincial grants that we do apply for, depending on what the projects are and whether or not we meet the criteria for any of the granting programs. And we do have a standing agreement with Public Sector Digest, which is a citywide. We use them as consultants and so on, and we're part of their program that they keep track of all of the grants that are coming, either provincially, federally, and we get notifications on every week of any new programs and when deadlines are up, so that, and they go to all of the directors, so that if they see something that comes up that meets some of one of their projects, then we look at trying to apply for those grants. Debentures for capital projects. Obviously, we have a number of large projects that come up that you really don't have the cash, and you're not going to pay cash for it. No different than you would go out and buy a house with cash. You would mortgage your house. We do the same thing as a municipality. Federal gas tax revenues is another program from the federal government, of which we get X number of dollars from their gas tax or their gas tax revenues, and those are earmarked to specific certain criteria of what projects that they can be applied for. And majority of the federal gas tax money that we've always received has gone towards roads, and we've kept the roads to keep the roads up to standards. Reserves and reserve funds. We do have a number of reserves and reserve funds. Difference between the two: reserves are more of operational type reserves. Reserve funds are funds that are actually invested and put into a bank. They earn interest either through investing or through the bank, and they're usually earmarked for specific programs. It could be development charges, federal gas tax money when we get it has to be, because the province or the federal government and the province tell us it has to be in an interest-bearing account, it has to earn interest while we have it. So those are the types of funds. If we have an infrastructure fund, the $6.2 million from the sale of NRBN, so that's an interest-bearing investment. So those are the types of reserves that we have, and they're mostly earmarked for specific projects and operations. Storm sewer flat fees we've talked about. We also have a grant program, as you know, that was talked about a bit tonight, of which we've invested $775,000, and the interest on that goes to pay for the grant program. Last year, Council did agree to start using some of the principal of that to top it up to a maximum of $30,000. So for example, this year we had $19,000 worth of interest that we earned in 2018 to be spent in 2019 on grants. So if we were to have more grants that we had to put out, that maxed up to 30, we'd have to take $11,000 out of the off the principal amount. Additional revenue sources, new assessment growth. We have seen some growth in the municipality with regards to some new buildings. Again, it is very limited, so we do see a little bit of gain there. Increase in user fees. The departments do look at the user fees, and you'll see a report that will come to council on January 28th, which is the consolidated user fee bylaw. And so all of the user fees of all the departments for the and for the city all comes under one bylaw with a number of schedules. And the departments were provided those schedules this year to look at their fees to determine whether or not there was increases were relevant. And some were increased, some stayed the same. So council will see that on the 28th. Capital charge on user fees. We've talked about putting a capital charge on ice rentals, for example. We do at Roselawn for people like for Showboat and so on that use Roselawn. There's a dollar per ticket or something like that that comes to the city, and it goes into a capital reserve for Roselawn. The net proceeds from the NRBN sale, that's the $6.2 million I mentioned. That's sitting in reserve waiting to be leveraged for larger projects from other government funding. Area surcharges for new projects that are financed by debentures, so those are your type of local improvements. It could be storm sewers also, but we're looking at creating a storm sewer utility itself. Increase in capital tax levy. So this year we've increased the capital tax levy by 1.5%, and that continues to grow and accumulate the capital funds that we do have to eliminate that infrastructure deficit that every municipality has. Tax room. Again, tax room for some of the new councillors is something that's created when either the region or the school boards reduce their tax rates or have a lower tax rate increase. And what it does is it creates an amount of room that the lower tier municipality can use to be able to increase our operations to cover our costs, whether it's a debenture or anything like that, which we have done over the past, and I'll show you in a slide further how we've done that. So the fact is if the regional tax levy or the education tax levy comes down, it creates that bit of room that the lower tier municipality can pick up and still come up with a cost of living 2.5% overall blended tax increase to the ratepayer. I understand this year though that the region is actually looking to increase a certain amount of taxes for things that they've been zero rate increases in the past, and they're looking at trying to right some of that. So we're not so sure how much that's going to be. The last is matured debentures for capital projects. I talked about that a bit. When capital projects are paid off and that debt then matures, we have those funds available to us for other functions or other projects. That's the revenue sources. Any questions on that, Mr. Mayor?
Nobody? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So I mentioned the Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund, or the OMPF Fund as we call it. So 2018 funding was almost $2.8 million. I have created this budget under the assumption that we would still get the $2.8 million. Obviously, if that changes, which it probably will, we're going to have to deal with it at the time. But that's to be determined. Right now, I've applied the $2.3 million to the operating levy, and we've applied that for the last 10 years that we've been getting those dollars. The additional $440,000, $340,000, you'll see in your package, and we'll go over that on Wednesday. $340,000 is allocated to one-time expenditures. So that way, if we lose that money, it's not affecting the tax levy. The other $100,000 we've allocated to the downtown CIP, Phase 1, which is a combination of a number of different funding sources, one being the grant, another being this particular fund, another one being the OCIF funds, the water budget, and so on, and it's spread over 2 years. So that's that fund. The OCIF fund, last year we got $260,000. It was raised in 2019 to $404,000, and I believe in 2020 it goes up to $440,000. We've applied, of the $324,000 to the downtown CIP, as I mentioned, and the other $80,000 is to continue to fund our capital asset and budget supervisor, which was approved by council last year, and it's being funded out of this program that allows us to pay for staffing that is related to our asset management plan. The new operations center. So over the last 4 years, we started working towards funding the operations center debt. So we started levying prior to us debenturing, which allowed us to spread out the tax levy increase over a number of years. And the reason we were able to do that was due to some of that tax room that I talked about before, because we were able to use those funds for our own purposes. So $365,000 was levied in 2016, another $130,000 in 2017 and 18, which left a balance of $114,000 that we need to levy this year, which you've seen in your budget package. I have an alternative to that $114,000 to take that out and fund it from essentially the option that I have there, which is to repurpose a portion of the fire hall matured debenture. We had $307,000 from the fire hall that is now paid off, and that $307,000 is available. So what I will be proposing to council is that we allocate $114,000 of that to the debenture, and we don't have to levy for that. And the reason being is that, one, it's going to lower our tax levy for this year and the tax rate this year. But whether we levy that this year or we levy it 2 years down the road, when you possibly may have a project that requires $307,000, then that you can actually phase that in over the next couple of years. You can budget $50,000 levy increase next year, and then have a minimum impact to the ratepayer. So that's something that can be phased in. So that's what I'm going to be proposing in the budget coming forward. Any questions on that? Okay. So where do we stand? Our operating levy is essentially at a base budget. We're coming in at 3.34%, and this is the levy increase. And I want to explain the difference. We have a levy increase, and we also have a property tax increase. Two different things. A lot of people tend to, especially the media, tend to look at the levy increases that's what the taxes are going up, and that's false. It's not true. The property tax is based on assessment. It's based on the phase-in assessments. It's based on the region, it's based on the education, it's based on the city's levy. So combination-wise, it doesn't mean, and I'll show you that in a minute through a slide as to how that really works. But it's not the same thing. Every year we do have a portion of lost revenues, which is very minimal, 0.33%. And as you can see, last year our base budget came in at 2.84. And here's where the storm sewer budget, we already talked about taking the storm sewer budget out of the levy, which is about 1%, and we remove that and we create a storm sewer budget that's a utility budget that's funded on its own. Those numbers all add up to a base budget of 2.59%. So that's what the base tax levy would be increase. Last year was 3.27%, and the year before 2.89%, just for comparable purposes. That does not include any capital levy or debentures. So the next slide, we start with the 2.59%, which is our base increase. And our capital budget increase is 1.5%. Last year was 1.25%, so this year it's $257,000. Last year was $200,000. And the Operations Center debenture, if we were to include it in our tax levy this year, it would be an additional 0.67%. And in total, we'd be looking at 4.76% of a tax levy increase, which includes our base level increase of 2.59, our capital levy increase, and the debenture. And what I'll show you a little in a few other slides a little later is what that 4.76 becomes when we take out the debenture for the Operations Center. Basically, it's 4.09% tax levy, but it's actually a 3.76% increase to the average ratepayer. And then,
Gary?
Thank you. Through you to Mr. Sinez. Peter, that capital budget increase going from 1.25 to 1.50, so that's to get the PSA number correctly over time.
Correct.
To make it sustainable.
Correct.
My question was, did the council of the day have the goal of whatever that number is to flatline at 1.25 till you get there? Or are you doing the 1.25 to 1.50 based on a projection that I'm not aware of, but they put in to the program? Or are you doing it ad hoc, like this year you think it should be 1.50, or was that already on a schedule?
Through Mr. Mayor, we started at $100,000, and that was going to take us probably about 20 years to reach our goal. 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, we went to 1.25%, and this year 1.5%. And with the 1.5%, it will take us just another 4 years to reach our goal of reaching our amortization amount for general levy. So we're getting there, and by increasing it incrementally over the years, we're getting there a lot sooner than later. Else it would have taken us another 5 years to get there.
Thanks, Councillor. Go ahead, Peter.
In addition to this, you will also see in your on the pages for the department requests an additional $306,000 of a number of things, part-time staff and so on, and obviously that will present about a 1.79% increase if council decides to do all of those items, which I don't anticipate that that's going to happen. So this is sort of a summary of what I just went through, which is showing what our levy increase for our administrative budget was, the actual dollars and the percentage. We take out the storm sewer, so we have our base budget of 2.59% or $443,000, and the Operations Center debt and the capital levy of $257,000. So we would be looking at a 4.7% tax levy increase, and which is about $814,000 increase to our levy. So that's sort of a summary. The next two slides, and if you want to look at them in your if you want to look at those within your package that I gave you, they're on the same page, which is good in your budget package. But I want to explain this particular slide to you. And what this slide tells us, and if you look at the city property tax columns, basically there's a dollar change and a percentage change. And I have a revenue neutral item there. And basically the first line is with no property assessment change and zero levy increase, which means an average residential property of $185,000 stays at $185,000, and council decides we don't need any more money. What we levied last year is good for this year, which we know that's not realistic. But what that tells us is that if we do nothing, the average residential homeowner would see a $55 decrease in their property taxes, and that is because of the phased-in assessment. Okay, higher assessments, but if my assessment didn't go up, I would see a $55 decrease. But we know that properties are increasing in value due to the phase-in. So the second line shows the average assessment going from 185,000 to 191,000, which is about a 2.9% increase. What that does is and that's with a zero levy increase, no more money from the city, but just with the increase in assessment, that increases the property homeowners' taxes by $44. But they still see an $11 decrease in their taxes. And this is why I say the tax levy increase and the property tax increase are two separate things. Because you're seeing, right from the start, without us doing anything to our budget, the ratepayer is already getting an $11 decrease. And a lot of that is due to we have some additional assessment within the municipality. On top of that, we add in our base levy increase, and that adds about $40. So now the increase is $29 because it takes into account the $10 decrease started from. And if we add in our capital levy and our operations center debt that we just saw, that's another $33. So our tax increase is about $63 to the average homeowner, which is about 4.03% on the tax levy. So even though our levy is 4.76%, the tax increase is 4.03%. Obviously, if we add new services and staffing, which is the next line, which is that 1.79%, obviously if we add in new services and taxes, then that obviously raises the amount of property tax, which would be about $91 if council approves all of those items, which we know won't fly at this point. So in comparison, the next slide I'm going to show you is, that's why I'm recommending the operations center debt to be funded out of the fire hall matured debenture. So if we just repurpose $114,000 in the levy, that's already in the levy, to fund the operations center debt, that 4.03%, when I go to the next slide, is 3.37%. So the same numbers happen at the beginning. So it's still an $11 decrease overall. Our operating budget of $40, so you're at $29. But with just the capital levy and not the operations center debt in there, it's $23. So it's $53 versus $63. And the difference is the 4.03% property tax increase to the average residential homeowner is reduced from 4.03% to 3.37%. And that is repurposing the fire debt that's already in our levy and repurposing $114,000 to cover that cost. Any questions on that? Gary?
There's no questions, but for the press and the taxpayer, it's going to be whatever that number is, plus $100 this year.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to show you that in a minute too. Okay. Talked about the blended tax summary. So starting from the bottom, as you can see, back in 2016, we had a 7% tax levy increase. But when we blended our tax levy increase and we blended it with the region and the education tax rates going down, the average residential homeowner saw a 1.79% increase, or $51. Same as in 2017, we had a 4.7% increase. It ended up being just under 3%. In 2018, we had a 6.7% increase in our levy, but it was a 2.69% increase to the average residential homeowner. So in 2019, we can have a 4.7% increase, or we can have a 4.09% increase, depending on what council approves, or 6.55 is the high end. But we'd have to wait to see what happens with the region and the education. I'm anticipating the education tax rates will go down. They have every year, and the fact that they've already cut some of the funding to the school boards, I'm anticipating the tax rates should come down and provide enough room that maybe it'll cover any increase that either the region or the city has to a certain degree. So we don't know what that is yet, and we'll have to sort of wait and see. The other thing I bring to your attention is tax ratios. The right side of this is it's regional policy for a lot of the new councillors. Is a regional policy that the region is in charge of and determines what the tax ratios are. And tax ratios are the number that determines the distribution of taxes between classes, between your residential. Residential is 1 basically, and commercial can be 1.76. So the tax ratio goes up from commercial to industrial and so on. So the tax ratios, multi-res is in there. Last year they reduced the multi-res tax ratio, reduced the commercial tax ratio, so they don't pay as much. But what happens is because you still have to raise the same amount of money, it has an effect on the residential tax class and all the other tax classes. So it's just a redistribution really of the funds that you're collecting for our operations. Okay, so the next couple slides, this is what we're going to be looking at on Wednesday. So the couple sheets that are in our binders, we have total requests of about $2 million. Of that, $340,000 is being funded through the OMPF. Obviously, if that funding goes away, we're going to have to revisit that. It's also being funded out of reserve funds, other grants. We've deferred some of the funding. The annual capital levy, the increase of $257,000, and the operations debt is also part of there. But if we fund that from the matured debt, that'll come off that. And there's a potential levy increase of $306,000, and those are items that staff have brought forward that would affect the levy. And so if council was to approve those items, it's going to increase the levy, and that's made up of a number of things. Community safety. This was a memo that came from CAO Louis to council about the community safety and the downtown area, and putting some money towards security cameras, that type of thing. And it was proposed at about 0.5% of the levy, which is $85,000. That's not a number written in stone. It's a number that what does council want to spend? It could be $50,000, it could be $10,000, it could be $100,000. That's the determination of council. There's $5,000 in there for rural stone road repairs, sort of a given. There's about $94,000 request for part-time staff, and that does not include the additional $34,000 in your revised sheet that I gave you tonight for part-time staff for customer service. Records management license fee, we're getting into more records management programs, hiring. Amber will be able to speak more to it on Wednesday, but getting into an agenda and a records management is something that's been on our agenda for the last number of years in order to keep track of our records and properly, I guess. New fishing tournaments, request for $25,000 to get into some new fishing tournaments out of community services. Canal Days Festival, request of $53,500. Physician recruitment, an additional $16,000, and some economic development initiatives of about $18,000. And you'll get into the detail of these on Wednesday, and staff will be here to speak to any one of those items that council wants to ask questions on and give more information to council so that you can have a good understanding of what staff is asking for. So obviously there's the potential levy increase based on what council approves of those items on going Wednesday in the next meeting. Any questions on that? Okay. Storm sewer.
Peter?
Oops.
Eric?
Yep.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, to Peter. I had a constituent send me an email recently, and it's particularly about the budget. And he went on the Niagara Region website. If you go through the regional website, and you can see what your property tax is.
Yep.
And then through that, it shows a graph that splits up where your money goes.
Correct.
Are you familiar with this?
Yes.
Okay, so he went through and we put for a property that costs about $200,000 in Port Colborne, it would cost the average resident would be $3,332.60.
Okay.
And majority of that would go to the levy, the tax levy. And what I noticed, and when you compared Port Colborne to the other municipalities in the region, we had the highest rate. It was like 50.5% or something like that of the property tax assessment went to the city of Port Colborne. Whereas a municipality like Thorold, which I like to compare us to Thorold because we're very similar in size, and because we're from Niagara Region, it's comparing apples with apples in my opinion. They were only at 45%, and some of the other municipalities like Niagara Lake and were much less.
Okay.
So I'm just kind of wanting, and what his question was is, why is this? And I'm kind of curious too. Why, like, what's causing us to be so high?
Okay. Probably a few reasons. Essentially, it is difficult to compare municipality to municipality, and the reason I say that is the assessment base for every municipality is very different. Whether it, and it all depends on what especially what your commercial and your industrial assessment is based on. So we've lost industrial assessment over the years, which was a high contributor to our tax base. So once you start losing, especially some of your high-end industrial assessment, and you're basically majority of your revenue is coming from residential, it tends to increase on your residential side. We have a certain amount of money that we have to levy, and it depends on how much revenues we get from the government, how much revenues we get from user fees, and all of that as to how much of our portion of our tax levy. I mentioned that majority of our majority of our revenue is from a tax levy, which is about 71%. So 70% is quite a bit from our taxes. And it depends on the distribution of those taxes. How much are we getting from the industrial sector, how much you're getting from commercial, because they're at a higher tax rate. So they're contributing actually more dollars to your tax base than the residential. But if you don't have that, or it's reduced, then it puts the burden more on your residential ratepayer. Another reason is it depends on the types of services. Depends on the services of the municipality. Our services in Port Colborne can be very different from services in Thorold or other communities, Niagara Lake. We have a marina. Most municipalities don't have a marina. Now, mind you, our marina pays for itself, but still, there's still services that we still have to provide our marina. We have a grain elevator. We have a number of different things that we do. When we do construction, and Chris can attest to this, is that when we have to do contract services for putting in different services in the ground, we have a lot of rock, so the cost is higher. So there's a number of different, that's why I say there's a number of different reasons that our municipality's taxes may be quite different from another municipality. And so all of these things have to be taken into consideration. A number of years ago, I remember a previous CAO wanted to do a major comparison between our municipality and a whole number of municipalities and going through the FIR, Financial Information Return. And it was very difficult, and it never went anywhere because it was very difficult to compare municipality to municipality because they are so different in their makeups. So and I'm not sure if maybe Scott has anything else that he could think of to add to that.
I think, sure, I can take a crack at that. Through your worship, to Councillor Beauregard, the only thing I would add, that's an excellent answer, and that's exactly what I would have said. The other thing I would say is the region applies one rate to every property from Grimsby to Fort Erie. So they don't have the luxury of a different rate for each municipality. So that's how they levy their total budget. We do the same thing, but we're doing it on one municipality. And I would suggest there's different assessed values on the properties in Port Colborne as there is in Thorold. So Thorold is about the exact same population. And it's true that the assessment base is different. So the industrial, the mix of properties. And in fact, Peter talked about the tax ratios. So I would suggest that there's a rural and agricultural component to Thorold. I don't know for sure, but I think ours would be bigger. And you have to imagine that those property taxpayers pay a 25% or a quarter of what a residential property pays. The tax ratio is 0.25 for those, for managed forests and agricultural. So that difference has to come from somewhere, and it comes back to every other taxpayer. But when I talk about the assessed values of properties, I would suggest knowing what I know about real estate, which isn't very much. If you take a $200,000 home in Port Colborne and move it to Thorold, it's going to be worth more than $200,000. So say that number, I don't know, just to use, for argument's sake, $275,000. All of a sudden they're paying the same tax as they would have paid at $200,000 in Port Colborne. Region's still getting their money because they apply one rate for all of Niagara. So our rate is a bigger component of the pie chart, but our tax liability is probably about the same as if the exact same house was in Thorold, if that makes any sense. Okay?
And Mr. Mayor, in addition to that, it also depends on and you just brought up a point that triggered my mind on the assessed values in Port Colborne. Assessment in Port Colborne is actually a lot less than municipalities to the north or throughout Ontario. And to be honest with you, that's why we get $2.4 million from the province. The formula that the province uses for us to get the $2.4 million is based on assessment, and because Port Colborne's assessed values are a lot lower than the provincial average, that's why we get $2.4 million. No different than Welland. Welland gets a good chunk of money from the province based on the same thing. So when assessments here are a lot lower, it tends to up the taxes because we have to collect the same amount of money. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Peter. Yeah, that was a really good answer. Just my concern is that it seems like we have a levy that's going up, potentially the regional tax is going to go up, and we have a provincial government that is likely going to decrease our funding. So, and the people that get hurt are the residents of Port Colborne. And that's a concern that I'm having, and I hope we can work through it in the future. Thanks.
Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just your opinion, do you think it's fair that the region would charge everyone the same rate, each municipality in the region?
It's a good question.
In your professional opinion, how's that? You're retiring pretty soon, so.
Yes, so what I say, right? I would say no, because every municipality, I believe, gets a different type of service from the region. And again, it all depends on the municipality itself. Some municipalities tend to have more plants, more sewage plants. Well, that's water and sewer. More roads. Let's put it that way. They have more roads than they have to plow or maintain in Port Colborne. So there's definitely different levels of service from the regional perspective, I would think, from municipality to municipality, depending on the size of the municipality, depending on the types of what the infrastructure is like for the municipality. Obviously, even police services can be different within municipalities. Waste management can be different in municipalities, although waste management, they do levy based on the municipality itself and the types of service, so that's a little different. But housing and so on. So there are a number of different services that are quite different from municipality to municipality.
Okay, thank you, Councillor.
Do you agree to that, Mr. Mayor?
100%.
Okay, any other questions? Okay. We've talked about the storm sewer, so moving on to the storm sewer. So This is the schedule, and this is on, in your package. And I'm just gonna flip my notes here. So, the flat fee per year, we started out with, and under the section in your package for storm sewer, you'll see these couple of these schedules.
Page 8.
And so that's at page 49, starting at page 49 in your actual detailed budget. If you want to look at that. But basically what we did to give council an idea of how we came up with these numbers. Originally in the report that went to council back in 2015-16, for example, the heavy industrial was at $1,000. Light industrial, I think, was at $750. The commercial properties were up around the $400 mark. So, and council of the day said, you know what, those fees I believe are a little high. So we said, okay, we'll go back to the drawing board, and we did. And what we did was, I did a calculation based on looking at always keeping the single family property at $100, because we know that that's the average across most municipalities. And we looked at multi-res as a group and to tier those. And we looked at the commercial to tier those, and also the industrial. The bottom end basically are the same numbers as your multi-res or your commercial, depending on the type of property it is. So essentially what we did was, and it's on page, let me just give you this, the comparison, is on page 52, which is a comparison between two options, one being a tiered option, although these are tiered, and the other one was, what we did was, I took the tax ratios that we use for calculating taxes, property taxes, and used those ratios to determine what should the fee be if we were going to collect $740,000, basing the residential at $100, and the fact that if, for example, multi-res is 1.9 tax ratio. So, for example, if we were to collect $100 from 5,000 properties, we would get $510,000. If we had, if the tax ratio is 1.9, well then it would be $197 versus $100. So I took that $197 and looked at the reduced fee that we calculated, which was $150, and averaged those two out, and came up with $175 for the low end of the multi-res, 2 to 5 units. So I took two different types of scenarios as to how to calculate them, averaged them out, and basically we came up with this structure, which I think is a fair and decent structure. So you're looking at going from multi-res, which has 2 to 5 units. Obviously, a unit 6 to 9 units is going to be larger. There's going to be more runoff of stormwater, and any units that are greater than 10 is going to have more runoff. So what we did was, there's a $50 increase as you go up the scale. No different from commercial. Going from small, medium to large, we use the same scale of 175, 225, and 275. So in addition, $50 in the tiering of that. And then light industrial and heavy industrial, they're larger, usually larger properties. We have 375 and 475, and then the rest falls out from the numbers above. So with this type of flat fee, I think we came up with, from staff's perspective, is a fair and equitable solution to charging the fees. And it would raise us the $740,000 that we would require to fund this utility. So that's the fee structure and how we came about it. The next slide shows you how the funds would be appropriated. So in the year one, we would be collecting $740,000. $185,000 would go to the operating budget for storm sewer, which we talked about before. Of that, if you remember, if you look at the previous slide, the city owns some properties that we would have to charge ourselves those dollars. So we'd have to charge ourselves that $200, whatever it is. What that actually calculates to is about $30,000 that we'd have to pay, just like we have to pay, the city facilities have to pay our water bill too. So we would have to pay our storm sewer fee. So that would come out of the budget. And that would leave $525,000 of funding for capital purposes. We know right now we have to start paying our debenture this year of $300,000. So that would come off the $525,000. We're left with $225,000 in the reserve. That will, as you can see, accumulate over the years. And you'll notice what I've done in year 5. Well, for one, I've assumed about a 2% cost of living increase, and I've added that into the fees that we're collecting, and also the operating costs is a 2% increase there. So what I have done in year 5 said, okay, well, in year 5, we want to do, or Chris wants to do, on approval of council, another storm sewer project worth about $5.5 million. And if we did that, then our debenture goes up from $300,000 to $600,000, but we still have $900,000 in the reserve to do some of the smaller storm sewer projects that may be required. And that would continue to grow, and we're able to do some additional projects. If another storm sewer was required to be done for another $300,000, we're able to do that with the existing capital funding there. So we have a stable funding source that's able to now go forward and start doing some of the storm sewer work that's been on the books for the last 10 years that we haven't been able to get to because we haven't created that funding mechanism in order to provide the capital projects to go forward.
Gary?
So,
What are you debenturing these storm sewers over? What period of time?
the Nichols Street storm sewer was over 30 years. So when you debenture, you normally try to debenture over the life cycle of the asset that you're purchasing or creating there. So normally you would try to gear it towards the life cycle of the project. Now, storm sewer could be 50 years, but 30 years is sort of the high end.
Gary?
I guess what I'm worried about is that if you increase the 2% a year, so next year it's $102.
Right.
Are you still not easily falling behind the construction cost index? So we're thinking we're growing the fund, but if the cost of storm sewers goes up 4% a year, and we're raising ours by 2%, we're into that age-old thing of we don't keep up.
Yeah.
So after 10 years, you're behind by 20%. If it's 4% versus 2%.
Sure, through Mr. Mayor, that would be something that Chris and we'd have to look at as to, okay, what is that? I'm assuming a 2% cost of living increase that definitely changes year to year. So whatever that is, and is the cost of living normally in line with your construction index, Chris?
Through for Mr. Mayor to Peter.
That's different, eh?
It has varied depending on the year, but this past year in 18, the average cost was just shy of 3%, so it was 2.87 or something.
So it's fairly close.
Okay,
That's
Gary?
the construction cost.
Yes.
Yeah, because just normally in your rate of inflation is the average of everything.
Yes.
You extrapolate that construction out of it, it's always higher.
Yes.
In the insurance industry, we deal the same thing every day with regards to the rebuilding cost of homes. That percentage is always way higher than what you see in the paper as your cost of living. So I think our companies now are around 4% per year on an average rebuild of a house, what they're using. Now, some of that has to do with debris removal and things like that, dumping fees, but they're using around 4%. So that kind of gives you an idea, Gary, about, as Chris said, with us just digging new all the time, replacing something would be a little less than rebuilding a house with debris removal. But you're bang on by saying it is higher. So, Andy?
Thank you. Through you to Peter. When we do projects such as the downtown CIP, and we're looking at the storm sewer component of that, would we treat that separately and take that out of the financing just for the CIP, or would we take the storm sewer cost to bring it back to this? How would we do that?
Yeah. Through you, Mr. Mayor. With regard to what we're doing right now with the downtown CIP, there is a water and a sewer component, part of that, and that's going to be part of come out of the water and the sewer budget for that particular program. Doesn't mean to say that council, we can do if we get grant money, and the grant money incorporates, yes, you can do storm sewers and so on, then the money would come out of the grant money. So it all depends on the type of program that we may be involved in. And it could come out of our capital reserve if we need to, or it could come out of our infrastructure reserve that we have, because it's earmarked for infrastructure. Doesn't matter if it's storm, sewer, water, whatever council approves, and staff recommends and council approves, then that's where the funds would come from. Doesn't necessarily have to come from this particular utility budget, but it could come from other sources.
Okay, thanks, Ange. Peter?
Chris.
Oh, sorry, Chris?
If I could give an example, if you think of this storm sewer reserve or fund that Peter's intending to create if council approves, think of it much like the water budget. To give you an example of how that works with grant funds in the past, the Lakeshore water main installation was a good example of that. We were able to leverage through a grant from the different levels of government in excess of $2 million. We only had to go to the water budget reserve and get another $800,000 in debentures. So what happens was what actually came out of the tax and out of these reserves was very minute compared to what the actual cost of the project was. So this allows us to do those types of things. That's what the intent of this is.
Okay. So the storm sewer fee and property tax comparison, we talked about this a little bit earlier, and I had mentioned that the additional cost is about $16 to the average residential homeowner. So if you look at the right-hand side, it's probably easier to explain. So if the average residential homeowner, if their property taxes was $1,645, and if we just wanted to, if council just says, you know what, just levy the $300,000 debenture that we have to pay for the Nickel area storm sewer, that would add about $27 to the average homeowner. But if council said, well, wait a minute, you want to create this $740,000 fund, and if we can't create it by fees, a fee structure, we're going to create it by the levy, and we add $740,000 to the levy, it's another $40. It's another $40 added to the property taxes. So the actual increase, if we were to levy $740,000 just to the average homeowner, $185,000 assessment, would be $67. Now that doesn't. Now, if your assessment's obviously higher, that number is going to be higher. If the number's lower, it's going to be lower. But if so there's where the inequitable part of it comes into play. If we charge $100 storm sewer, that means they're paying about $33 more. But we're also taking out the storm sewer budget, that $185,000. So that actually reduces it by 17 bucks. So the overall cost to the average homeowner is $16. Whether we levy or we do put it put a storm sewer utility budget together. Obviously, if your assessment is a lot higher than if it was based on the levy, then it would be a lot higher than that. So that's why we're saying to go to a flat fee rather than a levy is, I think, a lot more fair and equitable to the homeowners. Yes, there's going to be a little bit more of an increase overall, but if we had to levy all of that, you'd see a $68 increase anyway. So I think going forward, our recommendation is that council look at the storm sewer fee structure, because we think it's something that, one, I think to be responsible enough to move forward in the projects of storm sewers, and we know that we have issues with storm sewers, and every municipality in Ontario does. I think to be proactive and to start this program and get it going, I think this is the way to go in ensuring that every property owner is actually paying the same amount towards their storm sewer, these storm sewer projects.
So Peter, in essence, it does bring us more in line to the government mandated asset management that we have to do. Correct.
Correct. And that's all part of, and actually it's a good point, because when we did the presentation to council back in 2015, I think it was, 16, our asset management plan's in place, and in looking at our storm sewer assets, and if we had to replace those assets, we have to raise the same amount of money, no different than what the consultant came up with dollar-wise. So, and that's based on just on a life cycle rather than a condition, because also it depends on the conditions of the assets. It depends on the condition of the storm sewer. If the storm sewer is in good condition, you're not going to replace it, but there are ones that we know that are failing, and those are the ones that need to be replaced, and this program will get those things, those storm sewers replaced.
Mark?
So Peter, after all this, I'm gonna go home, I'm gonna get a phone call tomorrow morning. He said, somebody just said, I pay $300 every water bill. How's it gonna change my water bill, the bottom line?
This won't change the water bill because it's
If we approve
totally separate
the
budget.
Okay, so he's still gonna pay $300 every water bill like he is now, unless the price goes up, of course.
Correct.
And it's gonna be added another $100 a year for the storm sewer fee if it's approved.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, whether it's on the water bill or the tax bill, you know, if council approves this, then we'll determine, okay, what's our best way of collecting the funds, whether it's on the water bill or the tax bill. But basically, it's $25 a bill, because you have 4 bills in taxes. You have your interim bill with 2 installments. You have 4 water bills, so basically you're looking at $25 a quarter.
Just to clarify, the stormwater system was never to be in with your water sewer.
No, it's a separate.
Apples and oranges.
Yeah.
So that's why we've.
Yeah. The water and sewer budget is a self-sustaining budget with separate rates, separate expenditures and operations, and that is that'll be coming forward in the next month for council, and where the general tax levy covers the general operations of the municipality, and then this will be a separate utility that'll just cover and be dedicated to storm sewer work. Yeah. Okay. We're almost done. The next few slides, and you have them in your package. I just put these together as an information. I think some of the councillors in the past like to see, you know, what percentage of our revenues is collected from tax levy versus provincial funding versus user fees and so on. So as I mentioned, 71%, that's the large purple part of the pie, that's tax revenue that comes in. 10% is from user fees, 9% is from provincial funding, and so on. So those are the major sources of funding that you see. So that's in 2019. The only difference in 2018 is our tax revenues was 70% versus 71% this year, and that was because the Ontario municipal funding is 9%, so that 1% change between the 2 years. As far as revenues go, this just shows the actual dollars that we do collect for revenues. So in 2019, based on the budget that's being proposed, it was about $17.9 million in tax revenue and $2.5 million in user fees and 2.345 from the province. And then you can see the rest of the dollars through either supplemental taxes, license fees, grants, and so on. So that just gives you a little idea of where the revenues come, what the revenue numbers are like for 2019, and similar, you can look at the 2018 is there also for you. On the expense side, The budgeted expenses, you can see where the funds are spent within each department. So administration, museum, engineering, planning, community and economic development, library, fire services, and you'll see the debentures. We're in the red, so we're at about $2 million that we spend in debenture payments. That's in 2019. 2018, our debentures was $2.2 million, and so as we pay down our debentures, it comes down. So this just gives you an idea of between 2018 and 19, you can see where the dollars are spent. The two-page department summary that I gave you tonight breaks it out a little bit more detail within each department as to where the dollars are spent. Percentage-wise, giving you the expenditures as a percentage of the overall budget. So you can see that 19% is administration, 22% engineering, 27% community, 9% is our debentures in 2019, and in last year, 10% of our budget was going towards debentures. So that just gives you, if any ratepayers ask you, well, how much are we spending in economic development or in community services or engineering, that'll give you sort of just a little bit of information to be able to tell your constituents that, hey, our debentures, we spend 9% on debentures or engineering and so on. And then you have the other sheet there that can break it down for you that I gave you this evening as to where dollars are being spent within each department. So it gives you an idea. And, because there's a number of municipal services that we spend operations on. Like people will come to you and say, well, what do we get for our tax dollars? Well, and I can provide this actually, I'll email this to council, but we have to maintain roads, bridges, sidewalks, street lights, storm sewers, snow plowing, parks, marina, beaches, the list goes on. So it's something that I know constituents have always said, well, what do my taxes go to? What do we pay for? And I think this is a good list that you may want to have in your back pocket to say, hey, this is what you're paying for. This is what you get. A lot of people I have come say, well, I live out in the rural area, so why am I paying for? Well, you do drive the roads, you do walk the sidewalks downtown, so on and so forth. So that's sort of will give you a little bit of information anyway that you can express and provide information to your constituents. Gary?
Mr. Mayor, Peter, just the favorite slide I used to like, there was a quick reference was what does 1% equal in terms of dollars raised, and what is that for the average house?
Right.
Could you tell us that?
So,
if it's in there, I didn't see it.
Yeah, 1% of the tax levy is $171,000, and I'll have to get the other number for you, Gary. Okay. Okay, the next slide here is just, this is what the previous council in the strategic planning session put down as what their priorities were, which was back in December of 2015. I just thought I'd bring this forward for council, especially for some of the newer council members, just to see what was being done and what has been completed. So you'll see the new operations center obviously complete, Nickel area storm sewer complete, Roselawn Heritage, we've done a lot of work on the Roselawn building. It's still in progress. There's still work to be done. Elm Street water main done. The east side employment lands, it's been designed. It's ready for servicing once the region brings their services over. Downtown CIP is in progress, and we have one phase ready to go, hopefully, with grant money. The marina dock assessment repairs, that report is done. It's in your package. The completion of the east waterfront CIP, is something that's still outstanding. Master plans have been completed. The Ward 4 fire protection, that's been reviewed and basically dismissed at this time. Remediation of the transport Canada lands, that's outstanding, sort of in relation with the waterfront CIP. And cultural block, that's the museum library, and they're continually to work on their enhancements. And the rail on apron completion, that again, that's tied in with the Transport Canada lands and the CIP East Side waterfront. So that's sort of the outstanding item that's from this list. And then once council has their strategic plan, then we'll see what list comes out of the next strategic plan of this council. So that's just for information purposes for council.
And tomorrow we'll be meeting with regards to item 5 with the region on that. One of the things we're going to be talking about tomorrow with the CIO and Public Works.
See what the timing of all that is?
Yes. Both Councillor Butters and I are working to have that very quickly. Good. Councillor?
Thank you. Through you to whoever can answer this question. We did have a meeting with Dan Spadaway about the federal budget. He did the pre-budget consultations, and at that time he suggested again that we combine the East Waterfront CIP and the Downtown CIP in order to leverage more funding. We can pull projects out and do them, but combine the two of them, so in essence they become one CIP. Has any work been done on that yet?
Both the CIO and I can both answer that. CIO can go first.
Sure. Through your worship to Councillor Demery, I was going to say that I met with Director of Planning and Development, Dan Aquilina, the next day, sort of said, and that assertion has come a number of times from the MP's office. It would be great if they could be bundled together. Every time I talk to the director, it's described to me that the different stages they're at and the difficulty in bringing them together. And if it's okay with, I feel not comfortable giving the full answer, and I know for sure that Director Aquilina will be here on Wednesday, so maybe if we can put a pin in that and bring that back, but I will defer to the mayor in case he says something different than that.
No, just further. MP Badaway and I had a meeting with some of our staff last week. We talked about this project. The importance about tying in the waterfront CIP is with regards to the trade corridors, which this federal government has a big vested interest in. So there's further funds available with that. So that's why Vance wants to see us tied in, because it'll hopefully mean more funding for that whole entire Clarence Street down Welland Street into the canal lands, and then eventually to the Nickel Beach really is where it can end up. So we are working on that. I'm through Nancy, we're working on putting times together coming up in February, March with regards to meeting with the Minister of Transportation, and there's another minister which his name escapes me right now, with regards to the trade corridors. So those two, because that project ties in and with the land acquisition, those are in the works as we speak. So that's what I'm taking forward to them. But you're right. So Dan knows that we have to start working on those things. So that's all going to come forward. The big thing is there's funding available through the granting system and project system. There also maybe funding through their budget system. So we're hoping to tie into both of those asks, so to see how we can get the best bang for our buck.
I'm really glad to hear that. So bottom line is that the people can hear that is definitely going to happen. We are going to tie them together and make it one CIP. That's really, I want an assurance on that.
Yeah, and that's been a direction from our MP and his government. So we will work very hard to get that done as we see how we're going to have to phase that project in. So that some portions of that may not have to be done today, but as long as they know we're going to do it. So as we work in conjunction, depending on where the starting point is, as we move forward, that just drops right in because we've got the completed diagrams and plans and everything else.
Does it need direction of council? That's what I really wanted to know. So if we need to do that, then let's do it.
It will be at some point. I suppose through Amber we can, how can we, without tying us into it, can we bring it to the table? I think there's a way to do that.
I want to tie us into it.
No. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
I mean, if no funding ever came forward, let's say.
Yeah. No, I'm talking high level. Does it take direction of council to make sure that this actually, the two CIPs become one? And we can classify projects all we want within that, but.
That's right. I mean, it does come into play with our strat planning that's coming up. We'll get dates set for that very shortly. But Amber and I can work with other staff with regards to that on the proper wording to bring forward.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we do something to say, all right, council wants this, so it's going to happen. That's bottom line.
Good. Thank you, Councillor. Anybody else? Yep. Mark?
Just a point of clarification, we have the Nickel Street sewer shed complete, but That's after the final paving this spring, right?
Oh, there's lots more.
Yep.
I know we still have from settling over the there. I don't want anybody to think that we're done with them. No, not yet.
Chris, do you want to give a quick update on that?
You, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Bagu. You're absolutely right. There's paving that is scheduled for the spring and summer. We have done some remedial works on the paving in the interim to aid in our plowing efforts for the winter, but we're not done as you're thinking. We still have to do the pretty part, make things on the top look well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councilor. Peter?
Okay, so moving on to our capital section. So depreciation. We talked about that infrastructure deficit many times. So depreciation deficit, and this is based on historical cost life cycle. And so our total depreciation is $4.3 million, and that's the number that the province wants to get you at, the amortization of your assets, and basically that you have that amount of money to keep replenishing your assets on a go-forward basis. Of that, right now our capital levy is almost $2.2 million. That's with the additional $257,000 that we've included in this year's levy if approved by council. $35,000 for the library. We have other funding like OCIF funding and federal gas tax that are all capital funding related, so that's part of the capital program. So we're sitting at about just over $3 million in capital funding that we have available to us, and which means we're about $1.2 million short of that depreciation amount, which is about 28%. You can see where we were last year at 35%, at $1.5 million. With the to Councillor Bruno's point earlier, if we were just to keep for the next 5 years, $257,000, and that's 1.5% of this year's levy. But obviously, if you keep it at $257,000, it's going to be 1.25% of next year's levy, and so on. So you sort of want to keep that growing. But if you kept it at $257,000 in 5 years' time, we would be at the $4.3 million. Now, mind you to say, that depreciation amount changes annually also, depending on our assets, new assets that come in and assets that get depreciated. But that's sort of our goal of reaching, that $4.5 million of funding. And so, within the next 5 years, 4 or 5 years, depending on how much council continues to put aside over the next number of years, is when you'll reach the point where you're fully funded at the amortization amount. Not to say that when you look at the tangible capital asset program that we have and the asset management plan that has to be updated, and we'll get into that a little later, is $4.5 million may still not be enough because replacement costs continue to go up. But at some point in time, when the asset management plan is fully completed with all assets, not just core assets, but all of assets, and the financing strategy is put to all of the assets over a 10 or 20 year period, depending on when those assets. And the other point is, right now our asset management plan is based on life cycle, and we're in the middle of working with our consultants and staff to get all of the condition assessments of a lot of, especially water and wastewater and storm sewer and roads, into the system. And once conditions are in there, that'll give a different picture than what life cycle is, because conditions can be a lot better for the infrastructure than what the life cycle is telling us. And with that said, and all of the assets in the asset management plan, and a full-blown asset management plan, which is needed in 2024, I believe, then the strategy for how you're going to fund that comes into play. So you may have assets that say in 2020 you need $6 million. Well, we only have $3 million. Well, that means you got to look at those assets and say what can be pushed off into next year or year after and so on, and you keep adjusting that on an annual basis. So that'll be something for future staff and councils to work on.
Gary, do you have a question?
Yes, I'm pretty impressed with with how far you've come, I'm just wondering, you know, everybody's got an infrastructure deficit right across Canada.
Yeah.
How would you say, do you meet with your colleagues in the region? How are we stacked up against others, do you feel?
For the size of our municipality, I think we're in good shape. Some of the, obviously, the larger municipalities that have a larger tax base and so on are able to do a lot faster and get to this point a lot faster. They also have more staff resources to put the plans together and so on. So, but for a municipality of our size, I'm always told from our consultant that we're well ahead of the game.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Councillor. Peter, it's 8 o'clock. Why don't we take a 5-minute break?
Sure.
Since you finished that slide.
Yep.
So we'll be back here right at 5 after 8, and we'll continue. Okay?
Yep.
Thanks. Yep, turn your microphone on.
Do that. All right.
Thanks.
Okay, capital. So this is a listing of a number of the capital funds that we do have available to us as a municipality. And we spend the majority of this. And I'll show you that in the next slide. But we have federal gas tax, which we talked about, and 400,000 is going towards roads, 170 towards downtown CIP for roads, so it's still in the roads program. Facility LED lights, $50,000. We've seen a lot of our facilities, we've already been changing LED lights, and we're starting to see the savings. We also get grant money towards it from CMP, so that's a good thing. The OCIF we talked about, and the OMPF funds, we've allocated some towards the downtown CIP also. Capital levy of $1.9 million, plus the additional levy that we're proposing this year of $257,000. We do have some development charges still sitting in reserve for a little bit for water, wastewater, that type of thing. It's not a lot of money there. Parkland, we have about $150,000 for new parks, equipment for parks and things like that. Talked about matured debentures. We do have about $380,000 available because they're in our levy and they're not allocated to a debenture anymore, so they would go into a reserve or a capital project that council wants to do. We also have matured debentures that are already committed. So they've already been matured previous years and they're committed to funding other capital projects or other debentures. And I'll show you that in a minute. We have $450,000 in our general capital reserve. So if there's anything that comes up that we need to do, and we're trying to also slowly build up that capital reserve for future projects. And we still have the $6.2 million that's sitting in reserve from the NRBN sale of that. And obviously future mature debentures, if council decides to do something different, we can debenture. And provincial and federal grants are available as they come about. So what you'll see in the second part of the major portion of the detailed budget that we get into in the next few budgets is to look at $8.5 million of capital projects, of which I can say they're all funded, the $8.5 million in one way or another, and these are the areas that they're funded by. So they're funded through the capital levy, through reserves, federal gas tax money, OCIF grant, and the grant application, that's the $1.2 million that we've applied for the downtown CIP. $100,000 from the provincial funds. Hopefully it doesn't get cut. The public transit grant program, that was a grant that we received 2 years ago, and it's ongoing right now to complete the project in 2019, I believe. The downtown CIP, this is 2020 funding, the additional $2 million. This project is being funded over 2 years through a report, and then the report's in your package for the downtown CIP as to how it's being funded. So about $1.2 million of that is from the water and sewer budget for infrastructure there, and other funding from the OCIF and federal gas tax. Fire apparatus and the fire engine, and $985,000, and I have a program for that to fund that in those years, and I'll go through that in a minute. And then there's about $13,000 that we're just deferring unless we can come up with some additional funds for it. So when you do see that, we'll go through it, and if there's any items in the capital budget, because they are all funded, but if there's any questions on those particular items, we won't go through line by line, but council can raise any that they want more information on, or may say, why are we doing this, or you may have your own projects that you have in your back of your mind. So I talked about maturing debentures. So this is just a chart that shows the $370,000 that's matured in 2019 or in 2018 was our last payment, so it's available in 2019, and also shows our vehicles and Main Street CIP is maturing in 2020 and 2021. Those are the mature debentures from previous that are being used to fund the Main Street CIP. So they will be completed in 2021. And then in 2021, we also have the City Hall debenture mature, and in 2022, the fire vehicle debenture mature. And so keep those sort of in the back of your mind, because you're going to see them in a couple slides going forward. But it also shows you when they're available, and it gives you a rough idea of if we were to reinvest those dollars for a debenture, whether it be 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, how much of debentures that we can actually incur, whether it's go from $6.7 million to $13 million.
Just Eric and then Gary.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Peter. So forgive my ignorance, but can you just give me a quick definition of what a debenture is?
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yes, it's basically debt. We borrow. We borrow money. So we're just borrowing money for a capital project. Debentures, that's what they call them in the municipal world. So it's essentially debt, like a mortgage on your house. And basically you go through, in order to get incurred debt, you has to be passed by council, has to go through the region, and the region is the administrator of all of the debt for all the lower tier municipalities. And you can either borrow through the region that goes out to the market, or we go through Infrastructure Ontario. And normally Infrastructure Ontario has had better rates than the region through their market. And also Infrastructure Ontario also provides us the ability to go further out than 10 years. We can go 20 years and 30 years, where majority the last number of years the region has only been going out for 10-year projects.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Gary?
Peter, earlier tonight you talked about the retiring debentures for this year, spending a portion of it to fund the Ops Center.
Yes.
And the Ops Center Council had recommended putting the money in so we could pay it. So some of it was on last year's levy to pay that debenture?
No, what's remaining to put on this year's levy is $114,000.
And that's it? So it'll be captured in this recovery?
It would be captured this year. And what I'm proposing is that out of the $307,000 that's the fire hall that matured, that $114,000 be repurposed from that $307,000 to pay the debenture. We don't have to increase the tax levy for that. And the balance of that $307,000 would go into a reserve, and I'll show you how. Okay. I'll show you in a minute how I anticipate spending those dollars for you.
So we will have fully funded the Ops Center debenture from these retiring debentures. There won't be any question about that next year.
No, it'll be done.
Thank you.
Correct.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Okay, Peter.
Okay. So the debt reserves that we do have, I mentioned that we have the matured debt. So we have debt reserves we have a general debt reserve of $565,000 right now. And that is basically set aside, and it's paying for the debenture on the East Side Employment Lands. It's paying for the Marina Mobile Lift, which we debentured last year. And it's also paying for the Valley Health and Wellness Center. And through the Valley Health and Wellness Center, any of the sponsorship or donations that we've been receiving over the last number of years goes into this reserve to pay down the debt. And I'll show you in a minute that obviously Valley is our main source of revenue for the Valley Center for naming rights, and so that is going into this reserve to pay down the Health and Wellness Center debenture. There is, I'll tell you now, that there's a shortfall in 2021, and I'll show you how I anticipate council funding that in a minute. Mature debenture that's committed, I mentioned that before. $210,000 of it is committed until 2019 and 2020 for the Main Street CIP. 40,000 is committed for the marina lift, which is in that general debt reserve. The east side employment land's also in there, and then we have some funds that are going just into the general debt reserve, that $5,770,000. The matured debt that's new, that's available, is the marina and the fire hall. And we'll talk about that in 1 second. That's how we're going to deal with those funds. Okay? So, I mentioned the Valley Center. In 2020, we will still have $657,000 that we have to pay on the debt. And what I'm proposing is that the Main Street CIP, once it's paid off, that debenture in 2019 and 2020, that be repurposed. So that's the $69,000 in 2020. And then the $210,000 going forward that we're using for the Main Street CIP right now, we repurpose that because we paid that debt off. And we put it into this reserve to pay down the Valley Health and Wellness Center. There is obviously we didn't raise enough funds in fundraising that was the whole idea, that the fundraising that we would have for the Valley Center would pay for the debentures. We didn't raise enough for the Valley Center, so we'll be short $650,000, but this is a way that I think makes sense for council to ensure that that debt is paid without affecting the tax levy. So this money is already in the levy. It's just going to be repurposed to pay for this debt once it's finished paying off the Main Street CIP debt. Gary?
Thank you. Mr. Sinez, Valley Inco at the time was a 10-year naming rights?
Correct.
For $1 million?
1.25.
So the Valley Center is what, like 6 years old?
Correct.
So when would you start negotiating for not only the next 10 years, but any other naming rights in there?
There is an agreement with them, and we have to talk to them 1 year prior to the agreement terminating or coming up to the 10 years, and that is next year. And so that negotiation will start. So essentially what happens is they have an option in their agreement to continue and also continue with additional funds. Obviously, if that all comes to play and there's additional funds that come forward and that continues on, then that will help this scenario.
So even though that money might not be due to 2021, even though that money for the sponsorship might not actually be paid until 4 years from now, next year you're going to know whether you will be able to get some or all of that, correct?
We receive annual payments because it was a 10-year one annually, so we receive $125,000 a year. That let you know, the last payment that we will receive is in 2020, December of 2020, which is for 2021, because the agreement ends at the end of 2021. And that's why 2020 is when I have that we have to start funding it, because that's our last payment per the agreement that we have existing. And then
I'm just thinking, if you knew that you're going to get some money and you knew when it starts there, you could self-fund it and then pay back a reserve account here. So let's say
this is self-funding it.
Right.
This is self-funding it from money that we already have in our levy. Now, but this is under the assumption that we don't know what's going to happen going forward with Valet.
Right.
If we're going to get any further funding.
I'm with you. But it's a possibility that
if we get more funding, then
that could be diverted to something else.
This can be repurposed for something else. It may not be, but we may not get a full $657,000 because this debenture, if we're only, let's say we get $100,000, I don't know, 125, if it stays at 125,000, it's still not going to cover the debenture payment, which is 300 and some thousand dollars.
Right.
So we'll still have to use some of these funds, plus if there's a continued agreement, but it would be less of these funds that will have to be used.
Thank you. Thank you. CIF?
I think that answers the question.
That's the question. Good. Thanks, Scott.
Okay. Any other questions on that one?
Okay.
So again, what we're doing is taking money that we've already levied in our levy and in our budget, and that we've been paying for one thing, and now we don't have to pay that anymore. So it's like you paid off your house and you bought a car. So now I'm going to take that money that I used to pay for my house and I'm going to pay for my car now. So that's the general purpose of this. So I talked about the fire department, and these are a couple things that that came up last year's budget, and I had mentioned to previous council that I would come up with some type of financing strategy for some of the couple items for the fire department, even though they're not due until 2020 or 2022. So the self-contained breathing apparatus, or the SCBA, is about $450,000 in 2020. That's going to have to be replaced, and tomorrow the chief can probably explain more of that. But what we're recommending is that we take the fire department matured debt of the 307,000, 306,000, and out of that we repurpose $114,000 to pay for the operations center debt, and then it's over. We don't have to put any more in the levy, and that will also bring down our tax levy to that 3.37%. That leaves a balance of $192,000 that we would put into reserve in 2019 to be there for 2020. We'd also then take the same $192,000 that would be in 2020's budget and put it towards this particular capital project. Also, the marina debt payment, which I said was matured in 2019, put into the reserve of $73,000. Those three amounts equal $457,000, which covers the $450,000, which it may be a little bit more than $450,000. We don't know what the cost actually is at this point. And then what will happen is, with that scenario, the marina debt that we have allocated in 2019 is available in 2020 for another purpose, and the $192,000 is available in 2021 for another purpose, whether it is for a new debenture, and then those payments would pay off the debenture, or if there's no debenture, those are funds that are available there for a capital project for that particular year, until you need it to pay for a debenture that you may incur, or a debt that you may incur for a future capital project. So that's what's being recommended. So it serves two purposes. One, it reduces our tax levy and property tax amount to the residential ratepayer, and it covers the cost in 2020 that we don't have to raise any other funds to pay for the $450,000 for the fire apparatus. Any questions on that?
Gary?
I guess my concern is that going back to the day we did a library debenture, and when it expired, we left the money there at the library for all the future things. So, if you follow that scenario, I know you didn't have to fund that one-time expense for the breathing apparatus somewhere else. That was originally why I asked the question about, sort of the IOU to ourselves with the Valley Center if they fund it, or, you go to them and say, listen, I'll give you 10 years for $800,000, but you pay it up front. Because if you left the fire department debenture there, they have some debentures now that are getting paid, I think, on a truck, but I'm sure they're going to have some future expenses for a truck and that. I guess I'm just seeing is if you just leave it there and it becomes its potential funding source for these projects. I mean, I don't know. I don't have any idea what the chief's plans are, what else needs to be replaced there. And yes, we could go out and start that process then if and when stuff is decided. I guess I was just thinking of it, it was kind of a logical way as these debentures expire for an entity that needs PSAB payments anyways, that it just stays there, only because it worked out well with the library, but I suppose that doesn't mean it works out well for every department.
So, through you, Mr. Mayor, there's no question, the $192,000 can still be there for fire if that's council's decision. But council can decide that something else comes up that they want to spend that money on, but it can still be earmarked for fire, but obviously any of the funds that we have in reserve can be changed by council any day to say, we want to repurpose that for this. So it is there for the fire, because obviously it was in fire, same as the marina. But what we're doing is, because of the fact that we may not need those funds for another project or for a larger debenture, because you can do one of two things. You can use the funds on an ongoing basis for capital projects forever, and you have, you know, what, $260,000, or you use that $260,000 to do a larger project, and that becomes your debenture payment. So you have two ways of looking at it, right? So, through you, Mr. Mayor, to your second part of your question as to a fire vehicle in the future.
Funny you should ask.
Funny you should ask that.
Is that planted, Gary?
No. There is a fire engine that the chief is proposing that needs to be replaced because it's coming to the end of its useful life in either 2021, 2022, of approximately $550,000. And the nice thing about maturing debentures, you know, staggered maturity debentures, is that we have in 2021 our City Hall debenture that's maturing, and in 2022 we have another fire vehicle that's maturing. Those funds, I'm recommending, either one of those, depending on the cost of the vehicle, can fund that vehicle. So again, you're using the same money to reinvest in the vehicle, and it won't cost the taxpayers any more dollars. So I'm going to just go back to 1A. So that was, option one was obviously using some of those dollars for the Ops Center and using the dollars in 2020 for the SCBA. I mentioned that the OMPF funds, we may be cut from the OMPF funds. And if that's the case, option 1A may come into play, and that is we still repurpose the $114,000 to the Ops Center debt. That leaves us $192,000, but what we can do is replace the OMPF funding if it's cut by the province, and it'll give us $265,000. It doesn't give us the $340,000 or the $440,000, but at least there's some funds there. And that can be used for some of the one-time expenditures if council decides they want to do some of those one-time expenditures. What that does to the funding of the SCBA is it just postpones it off to 2020. So the fire hall debt of in 2020 of the $192,000 and the marina debt, and then we'd have to use some of the actual capital levy of $187,000 to fund the rest of it. And we know that we're going to increase our capital levy in 2020 by $250,000 or $260,000. So, you know, it can be funded in 2020 if that becomes the case. But again, that'll be a council decision as to what happens if we don't get the OMPF funding. And then all of those funds will become available in 2021 for whatever projects may come forward, or debentures, or new major projects. So that's, I would say, recommending the Ops Center to be taken out of that, and then the residual is, depending on what happens with the OMPF funding, council can decide one way or another. Any questions? Okay. So where do we stand with our debt limits right now? I mentioned that our debt repayment limit is based on, from a provincial level, because the province dictates how much debt you can actually have, the maximum amount, and that's 25% of your net revenues. So our net revenues are just under $24,000. That's taxes, user fees, and all of that. It's net of grants. So 25% of it is $5.9 million. Council of the day, going way back, said, wait a minute, we're going to cap ourselves out at 20%, which is $4.7 million. So that's the highest amount of debt payments that the city would incur. Our current debt charges is around $2.5 million, which is about, if it's about 10% of our revenues. So we're still quite a bit under the 20% limit that the city's imposed upon themselves, which means under the city's repayment limit, we have about $2.3 million that we could incur in future debt, which can get you quite a bit of funds, and I'll show you that in a minute. If we went to the province, obviously $3.4 million. So with the city debt limit, which is $2.3 million, over 10 years, we could actually borrow still another $19 million, 20 years, $29 million, 30, $39 million. So we're in pretty good shape in the fact that we're only halfway there to our self-imposed debt limit versus the provincial debt limit. And that 5%, I call it the emergency debt room. So that difference between the provincial and the city-imposed debt room is about $1.2 million, or we can borrow $9.2 million if an emergency came up, if we happen to reach that point in time where you're at the highest debt limit. But I don't think that you'll ever get there. Any questions on that? Make sense? Okay, so where are we at with regard to our debt? So you can see 2017, 2018, that's when we did a lot of major projects and we did incur debt. So we went from 11.6 million in 2016 as our debt to 24.4 million in 2017, and that was a combination of the op center, 13.8 million, and our employment lands design of 450,000. Then it went up to 28.7 million in 2018 because we debentured $5.5 million for the Nickel Storm sewer area, of which we got $2 million of government grant to supplement that. And we borrowed money for the marina lift and to complete the water meter program. And that's why you see the spike there. At this point in time, we don't have, I don't think council has any, we don't have any approved debentures to move forward at this point in time until we know what a strategic plan is and where council's going over the next 4 years as to where any potential future projects are, which I have a slide on in a minute. Which is this, which is our last slide. So potential future debentures, one is the employment lands. So once the region gets the water mains over there and so on, and if council decides they want to service, the $8 million was a number that was kicked around a couple of years ago. More than likely it's gone up in price. But if it was $8 million over 30 years, our annual debt would be about $445,000, of which from 2020 to 2023, if it was to be built in 2023 or 2024, council could set aside or levy $129,000 every year and phase that debenture debt over 4 years, like we did with the operations center. The downtown CIP is another one that's been on the council's books. Obviously, we're phase one is we're waiting for the grant application to come through, but phase 2 to 6, which was in the report to council. So there's some costs there, and what the annual debt would be on those costs, and again, that's going to be over a period of time that depending on when council and how council wants to move forward with the CIP, and again, how much grant money that we may be able to apply for, and to leverage the $6.2 million that we have in the reserve for infrastructure. So that is the end. Any questions? That's the end of what I have with regard to the overall budget, and we'll get into detail on Wednesday. But our CAO Louis has a few slides that he'd like to go over. I'll change them for you if you want.
Oh, I was gonna stand. I can stand.
You want to come over here?
I'll stay here.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So I get to go, I don't know if everybody's asleep from 2 hours of financial information.
Oh, come on.
But now's the exciting stuff, HR. So, I was asked a couple of weeks ago, Peter comes into my office, said a couple of council members had requested a little bit of a deeper dive on the city's HR structure and specifically the organizational review that was conducted in 2017. So I did touch on this very briefly in orientation for council, but this is a little bit of a deeper dive. So in 2017, we were sitting right here at the same time of the year doing budget, and a couple of the council members, I guess I should say, sort of said, have we ever taken a look at who works where, who's in what roles, not the individual in the role, but is it the right role for the city? And same sort of thing, we sort of said, funny you should ask, we would like to budget for an organizational review. So that was, the idea of bringing in a consultant was budgeted for in 2017 and approved. The company that was eventually the successful bidder was Strategy Corp or Strategy Corps, depending on how you say it. And they were awarded the job, and they came in and they did interviews with council, interviews with all the department heads, directors, and managers. They did a sort of an environmental scan. They do this regularly. They specialize in municipalities. And they looked at sort of the external operating environment, similar sized municipalities like Thorold and beyond, and sort of compared us and came back with some recommendations later in the year. I'm going to go through those recommendations in a few minutes, but that was approved by council in 2017 and then sort of implemented in earnest then. It took a couple of months to get to full implementation. Some things council or senior staff in consultation with council decided not to do, but as of now, 2019, it is fully implemented. If anybody is out there waiting for the rest of it, it's done. It's implemented. So a couple of things they looked at, just bulleted list here. Operational activities are efficient, effective, and make appropriate use of resources. They compared our staff level to other municipalities as well as the needs internally of Port Colborne, because it's not always an apples to apples comparison with other municipalities, and really looked at our current org structure to see if it was effectively providing the services we need to run and administer the city. You can skip it, Peter, to the next one. So the findings, they did look at comparable municipalities from all over Ontario, and they said that we're in a similar financial position. We weren't necessarily better off or less well off than, and I think that's a good thing. We were on par with comparators. They said there's room for improvement. So I'm going to read this one because this is verbatim from their report. The city's current approach with respect to property tax, debt, and operating expenses do not in and of themselves demand organizational changes to the city's administrative structure. And given the state of Port Colborne's financial picture, the organizational review aims to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the city's administrative structure in delivering services. So that's what they were sort of looking at, and that's what they came back with. And so the recommendations, next slide, is a reduction in the number of full-time positions. That's the current staff complement that we had. And that was achieved through, and I'll go through their recommendations specifically in a minute, partly from some vacant positions that hadn't been staffed up being eliminated. An example of that would be sponsorship. At the time we had a vacant position. We were contracting out the service and using a third-party provider, and so they wanted to repurpose that salary into a different position than sponsorship. Some positions were merged together. I'm thinking specifically of in the clerk's department, lottery licensing and another position were combined into legislative assistant, which was one position. So we took 2 full-time staff and made them into 1. Also, I think one of the highlights of the reorg was that a new department was created, and that's Community and Economic Development. An easier way of saying that, and you're not allowed to say it, is Parks and Recreation. In the past, up until then, it's Community and Economic Development, and that's final. Up until then, parks operators, so the workers that get parks ready, that mow lawn and Zamboni ice and so on, were sort of in the operations department along with roads workers and water and wastewater workers. and the recreation workers, the people who put on events, who administer registration for different events and so on, they were in the Community and Corporate Services Department, which was along with clerks, finance, and community services. And that included the marina too. There was a bit of a disconnect. I think the consultants heard it loud and clear from staff. I think they heard it loud and clear from the council members that something had to be done to overcome that disconnect. And the recommendation that came forth was to combine those two distinct groups into one group, which is community and economic development. Interesting thing here that also changed is that economic development staff were actually repurposed into this department as well and out of the planning and development department. In some municipalities, economic development officers work directly for the land use planning department. In some, they report directly to the chief administrative officer. Sometimes they're a standalone corporation, like an outside body to the city. But they felt that the new thrust of community and economic development was really partly marketing the positive attributes of the city beyond the city's borders, and that there was a natural fit for economic development in that role. Also includes physician recruitment and health services and our farmers market that takes place in the city, because those are attributes that we wanted to market externally, or that the consultant recommended should be marketed externally. So new positions were deputy clerk, that didn't exist before. Facilities supervisor was recommended. This one was not actually eventually staffed, because we decided that the new reporting structure would have a manager. The intention was to have a supervisor and then 3 workers reporting to the supervisor. What staff did decide to do was to take that salary and make it into a 4th actual operator. So it gave us more capacity to actually work on buildings. Communications officer, which in a year and 2-month period has already paid dividends, I think. Director of Community and Economic Development, which is the staff person who oversees that new department that was created. And Manager of Parks and Recreation, which is a repurposed existing position, which previously reported to the director under the old system. So I'll now take you off of the slides and direct you to the 2 handouts I put on your desk. I apologize for viewers at home, but these would be entirely too small on that screen for anybody to make use of. The one that's all blue is basically the 2014 org chart, largely unchanged from 2014 until the consultants came to do the review. And you can see we're divided into four departments plus the library and museum, that being planning and development, engineering and operations, corporate and community services, and the fire department, all reporting through the chain of command to the CAO and council. The new org chart, besides being much more colorful, is, and this is updated, so we live in a fluid environment. There has been changes to this from the moment in time it was approved and the consultant brought it, even to today. In just a year and a half, there's been changes, and I can take council through some of those changes. So working at the top blue section, you'll see the CAO and the staff people who report directly to the CAO. That's health and safety, human resources, IT, and communications. And moving down a level and working from left to right in yellow, you'll see Director of Planning and Development. This is bylaw, building, and land use planning. And this no longer has economic development. So that was a change that was proposed and approved from the consultant's report. Everybody has a good handle on those roles, I think. If we need to get any of the roles, what people are actually responsible for, I can do that. Fire department, moving to the right, a little pinkish color is fire, and that was largely unchanged by the consultant's review. One thing I would like to say, it was addressed because it was, before I came to join the city, I understand it was an area of some discussion of whether or not there should be a deputy chief, deputy fire chief, and that was validated by the consultant's review. They said overwhelmingly, yes, that was a necessary position for the city. Moving again a step to the right with a purpley color is corporate services. And now there's been some changes here, and I'll take you through 2 specifically. This used to be, as I've already alluded to, corporate and community services and included the recreation side of Parks and Recreation. So the marina and the Valley Health and Wellness Center and any kind of programming from, youth programming to running canal days, running sports fest, and so on. So that was moved out, and we'll touch on where that ended up in a moment. The other change was a pretty substantial overhaul on the clerk side of corporate services. So corporate services shakes out into clerks and finance. Finance had minor changes. Clerks was where some jobs were repurposed, including the 2 roles that were moved into legislative assistant, the creation of the new role of deputy clerk, and at the consultant's recommendation, the idea of taking away a switchboard operator and making it a customer service representative and a licensing officer. Their recommendation was don't pay somebody a substantial wage to wait for the phone to ring. Understanding that's not particularly well received in some parts of the municipality, we are looking at making... nobody's ever said they like it, so I guess you could say unanimous. So, like I said, we work in a fluid environment. Staff are aware that something has to change, and in the budget, you'll actually see a proposal to bring back customer service to live answered phone calls, but to actually take it, I don't want to take too long, because we can talk about this on Wednesday and at future budget meetings, to take it a step further, because I'd suggest to council, the mayor and I have discussed it, the clerk and I have discussed it, having the phones be live answered and then transferred to an unattended voicemail at somebody else's desk isn't really a huge service improvement. What we want to have is customer service agents who will actually take queries, needs, requirements, all the way through to the natural conclusion. So rather than, you've reached the city, how can I help you? Oh, my garbage wasn't picked up. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the region, click. Taking it through to some kind of way of getting that person's garbage picked up or whatever the requirement is for the person that day. And that's going to require more than just a switchboard operator. And there's a budget request that corresponds, and I think there's a question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Scott. Scott, I do notice that there's a vacant cashier position here. Can that position be combined with this customer service agent?
Sure. Through your worship to Councillor Desmarais, that's a great question and very insightful. Some of these positions are marked vacant, by the way, but because this is from before Christmas, they have been staffed up. But we did proactively take the step, the director, the city clerk, and myself, of changing the job descriptions to put a customer service component in all of them. One of the problems, though, is coverage, because there still is only 3 bodies. Somebody's on vacation, somebody's on lunch, and more than 2 people phone at the same time, someone's getting into our voicemail system. One of the things, the budget request, and I won't get into too much detail because it's coming in a few days, right, is to get some part-time coverage that's going to take us through those vacations, take us through those lunch hours, and so on. The last thing I want is to say we're live answering everything and then not have enough staff to make sure that the second and third and fourth caller are getting a live person. So I'll move on from, I think that pretty much covers clerks and finance and the changes that were recommended by the consultant therein. They did actually, you've heard a lot about capital assets today and tangible capital asset management. They recommended the 2-person team in capital assets that was initially a 1-person team, and that's in response to those requirements from the accounting bodies in the province. Still moving to the right in green, library, no substantial changes there. Museum, no changes in the museum structure. Those are pretty much the structure that has been in place for years and before this exercise took place. Moving to the bottom left-hand corner, engineering and operations. So we know that engineering moved to a new department around the same time as this was all taking place. The parks workers did move to the new building, but there's a different reporting structure. So they report through their manager to the new director, but they're housed still with operations staff, and that allows them to share equipment and to collaborate on projects. The other change that was proposed here was a a virtual brand-new reporting silo under Manager of Engineering Services and Facility Maintenance. One of the things that came back from numerous people to the consultants was that there was no real body in the city that was responsible for maintaining our own assets. So things like winterizing the marina so that there's not burst pipes and floods, things like replacing sidewalks at the library. There was a lack of clarity on who was responsible to administer those types of jobs, whether it was a contract with an outside provider or whether it was city staff providing the service. So for really the first time, a building maintenance department for city buildings was brought in, and so far that's also proven to be very effective in the last year and a half. And one last step to the right, and the peach color is our new department, which is Community and Economic Development. And working from left to right, you can see that we have health services reporting directly to the director, and under the manager who was put in place, basically the 4 business lines, or I guess 5 business lines, which are events, arenas and parks, Roselawn, marina, and then community sports, and the health and wellness center, some of the activities that take place there, as well as Nickel Beach and summer camps that we were able to start in the last season. We brought on our own programming that we haven't had in the past. So that is basically every position that exists at the city. You can actually see the names on the copies that I've provided. And I hope that provides some clarity on what's different than before and what stayed the same. And I'm more than willing to answer any questions, Your Worship.
Eric?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Scott. Was there, so you mentioned some of the changes that have happened through the reorg. What are some things that council did not adopt that,
sure,
if there are any?
I guess so. I've only brought excerpts of the report here. One of the recommendations, and some of them are sensitive because they involve employees who are currently in their role, and maybe that role was slated to change, but a decision was made to not change them. So I don't want to alarm any currently serving employees, but some of the recommendations that were before them involved moving around reporting structures. For example, under the CAO is information technology. A discussion was held as to whether information technology is a a corporate service, which would naturally fit under the Director of Corporate Services, or whether it was a strategic type service that would report directly to the CAO. So I can tell you, if you had the full report, which you don't, it was presented in camera, and as an in-camera document, it remains confidential. Okay. They wanted the staff at the most senior levels to be very much focused on strategic type initiatives, and particularly at the CAO's level. So they wanted the people who reported to me as CAO to be strategic in nature. And the discussion that was held there was, should human resources be a corporate service or strategic? And it depends if you're talking about hiring and firing, or if you're talking about employee wellness and staff morale and culture. IT, which I just mentioned, same thing. The decision was made to leave it there. And economic development. There was a long, long discussion between council and the consultants on whether economic development should report to planning, report to community, and where it is eventually now, community development, or directly to the CAO's office, working in conjunction with the mayor and CAO on economic development initiatives. And I can tell you there's still debate as to where the right fit is. But I can tell you ultimately what was approved by council is in place, and we're always sort of looking at it and ready to tinker if we need to be reactive.
Okay. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Amber, actually, city clerk. Would we be able to go into a closed meeting and have access to those documents? Is that procedurally possible?
We can have a closed meeting with an update regarding the organizational structure. I recommend not right now, just because we don't have access to get you copies of the material, but an upcoming meeting for sure.
Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Yeah, Eric, we can schedule it. We'll work with the staff and pick the right date for.
So, yeah, I'd also pile on and say, through your worship, to Councillor Beauregard, we do have strategic planning coming up and a chance to talk about strategic changes to the organization. You know, I wouldn't throw this out, I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but if there was an opportunity to revisit something, strategic planning is another opportunity to do that too. So I have one more slide if there's no more questions, and this is more a financial piece. It deviates a little bit, Peter, if you could skip. Not sure if you can see it on there, but I think there is a copy on the last page of Peter's presentation. So I tried just to provide some clarity on what exactly our full-time, part-time staff and the salaries and benefits cost to the city, or what the amount that hits the budget. And so working from, I guess right to left, 2014 till today's proposed budget, or what's going to be before you in the weeks to come, I want to direct you to the very bottom line. So the bottom line is the percentage of wages and benefits of the entire spend, of the entire 2019 budget. And I think you want this numbered, and I think if you looked at municipalities in Niagara and all of Ontario, you'd see that it's around half of the budget. Most of our money is tied up in our people. And so this number hovers around 49% in 2014 to just about 0.5% less, 49.3% this year. So it is, even though we've had changes in staff and changes in wages, it's staying the same. I'll take you up 4 lines to the actual total. The percentages are actually probably better. So year over year increase, the 3rd line from the bottom. Once again, this year is on the leftmost column, so you're working from right to left. You're looking at about a 1%, 1.75% increase in 2015 over 14. 2016 is a 3.74% over 15. Now in 2016, we negotiated a new contract with our collective bargaining with CUPE. The wages were not 3.74%, they were 1.5%. That was a 4-year contract that senior management's fairly proud of being able to secure 4 years with increases of 1.5 to 1.75%. And what you will see though is sometimes the benefits go up as well. These numbers are too, they're not always a staff increase. Sometimes it's more benefits because of a maternity leave, because the new person is being paid while the other person is still on the city's benefits while they're taking their year of mat leave. 2016 to 2017, only 2.3%. 2017 to 18, there's a sizable jump. That's about 6.5%. Those who were on council then will recall that we completed an entire non-union salary review. This was done by a consultant again. It was started in 2014 before my time with the city and finally completed in 2018. And what we looked at is our internal equity. That's how different positions are paid in relation to each other. Our mandatory pay equity with the province, that's how women are paid in relation, workers in female type jobs, because it could be a male in a female classified job, are paid in relation to their male comparators. And one component of this, at council's request, was also external market conditions. So how well we're paying our staff compared to the cities and towns around us and of the same size as us beyond Niagara. And that was part of the recruitment and retention policies that council wanted to see in place to make sure that we are an attractive employer to outside candidates, as well as being able to retain our inside workers by offering competitive wages. So that did hit the budget, and it hit at the tune of about 6.5%. I can't tell you how much is wages and how much is benefits. I don't have that breakdown. And then in this year, from last year, 5.8%, and the proposal there would be new positions as well as increases to existing staff. And that's it.
Angie.
Thank you. Through you to Scott again. Scott, it would maybe be good information for new councillors to have some idea of how we do compare to other municipalities, because although we did make some adjustments to try to be more attractive, we still fall short of the mark. And I think it's important for new councillors to know that we're not a very high-paying municipality, and many times we have a problem when it comes to recruiting talent for that reason. So if you could maybe get those numbers and let them see them, that would be helpful.
Yep, through your worship to Councillor Desmarais, that's not numbers I have handy. Anecdotally, I can report that we're on the low end. We are one of the smaller municipalities in Niagara too. So what we have to do is balance a sort of fine line between the market conditions and our ability to pay, because absolutely, ability to pay is a component of compensation. And I think when you take a job at a smaller city, you understand that it's not going to be as competitive as something in the GTA, even something in the north end of Niagara. But what we try to do is offer quality of work, working conditions, non-monetary compensation, that's development, training, conferences where people can sharpen their skills. And unfortunately, we still do lose people sometimes to the higher paying employer. If I can get the stats and make it quantified.
Okay. All right. Is that it, Peter? That's it. So, I know, oh, sorry. No, we're not there yet. Counselor, counselor, counselor. I know you just woke up to do that, but I know. So counselors, we got to thank Peter because it's almost his last budget. We're just started. Well, I mean the big budget, the one that really means a lot. Although water means a lot too. So we thank Peter for this and staff. But Wednesday really is the day to come forward with. Start with your asks. There may be things in here that you may not want to do. That's what we go through. There may be things that aren't in here that you want to bring forward, and that's the time to do it, is to start those on Wednesday to get them on the table. One thing we'll do, and Peter and I discussed this today, was the fact that some of these items we're not going to go through line by line, because we may just do it in bulk and pass it, which has been done in the past. You know, if you don't want to change certain things, we'll do it that way. Because to be quite honest, if you want to do line by line items, we'll be here till June, if not longer. I'll tell you that right now. We don't have to worry about the price of paper clips, which was done in the past. Anyways, but all the staff will be here to answer every question. So make sure you bring your questions forward. It'll be very similar to this. We'll go through with questions and answers, and we can pick Peter's 1 and 1A and those type of choices, how we want to move money around and make it work the best for us. So, all right. Anything to add, staff? And any more questions? Yes, Councillor.
Just a question. People from the public come Wednesday and ask
Listen
questions just like us? Actually ask questions or make suggestions?
No, it's where we delve into...
It's more of a committee?
It's our committee to delve in. If they have questions, they can ask us after. We'll bring it back to staff and give them an answer.
Or they can contact us before.
Or beforehand if they have...
Wednesday. And when is our timetable to complete our section of the budget? As compared to the region? Are you looking at Wednesday to finish everything, or?
No.
That's not really, okay, good.
So, through your worship, to Councillor Bagu, so this is the first budget meeting. It's basically on time with prior councils. Second one on Wednesday. We've done it in 3 meetings in the past. We can do it in 4. So what you're approving, though, is our expenditures. The eventual tax rates have to wait for other outside parties. So you won't see what you're giving permission to if and when you approve the budget in the 3rd or 4th budget meeting, which will be in the weeks after this week, is staff to go out and run their departments and spend that money, and if it's a construction project, release the tender documents. But you won't see tax rates and an actual bylaw in front of you until probably May or the start of June. So there's no deadline or timeline per se, but you'll probably finish this budget in 3 or maybe a 4th very short meeting.
Now, just for the new councillors here, because what's done in the past is there's times that we look to Peter and say, okay, Peter, after these 3 meetings, we have X as our tax levy. However, as a group, or one person can bring it forward and the group votes on it, we want to see it 2 points less than that, or a point less than that, or half a point less. Then we would send Peter back, and he would work with all departments to look for efficiencies or anything that they haven't already done. Because we assume that every year they're looking for efficiencies, that they have to bring, if it's the will of this council, that they have to bring the budget down to a certain number. After Wednesday and next week, you may very well be very happy with what's here. It produces a good product for our community, at a reasonable price, and then you just move forward. And then we wait for all the other information to come down from the province with regards to their grants, the region's tax levy, and the education tax.
Button here. Just in addition to that, what I've usually done in the past is guided council through that with the mayor. And essentially what we'll be looking at is that 2 pages of the staff requests. Because those items there are ones that will affect or could affect the tax levy. So you know where we stand right now with the tax levy and how it's affecting an average property taxpayer. And what I would suggest is, and what we've done in the past is, any of the items I'll show you on Wednesday, any of the items that's under the column tax levy, additional tax levy, those will be the ones that the council definitely wants to review, get answers from staff on, and deal with, because they're going to actually affect the tax levy that we're going to move forward with. The other ones that are funded either through the OMPF funds, the provincial funding, or reserves or grants, what I would suggest is if there's any items, any of those particular items that you want additional information, want staff to maybe provide you more information or talk about or discuss, bring those up one at a time type of thing, based on whatever councilor wants to discuss. But line by line would only be for, I would say, would only recommend only be for the line items that actually affect the tax levy. The other ones would be if a certain councilor wants to discuss this one here that's under the OMPF funds, or why are we doing that, or will give us some more explanation of it, then that can be done there instead of going one line by line. Obviously, any of the items that are under the OMPF funding, if council approves that at this point in time, and we know that we're going to get a decision from the province as to how much money we got, then hopefully we'll have a decision from the province by the time we get to our maybe 3rd meeting or 4th meeting, and we'll have to then decide what to do based on the amount of funds that we do get from the province. As far as the capital one project goes, that would be the next step in determining, once we look at the operating levy, and the council's made their decisions on how they want to do that, including funding the operations center through the matured debenture, get approval of council of that. Then we'll get into the capital pages, which are the 3 pages. They're all funded, and again, what I would suggest to council is that any particular item that a councilor wants to deal with or have more discussion or more information on, bring those things forward. So go through those pages and identify ones that you want maybe some more explanation on, and then we'll deal with those ones there instead of going line by line, because as the mayor said, that'll take forever. So look at it. That's the way we've done in the past, and it's worked quite well.
So with going forward, don't be afraid to throw something on the table. One thing Peter is very good at is when, there's items in here that will increase your levy, you could throw them out there on Wednesday. Peter will show you, and he'll show you how that levy goes up and down as you add and subtract things. Yeah. So we may add things in there, and by the end of the night, you could have a 10% levy increase. Right. Not that that's what we want, but then as you want to scale back, what projects on the consensus of this council you want to chop off to make sure that levy increase, or whatever the levy may be, what it is at the end of the day that we want to look for. So, Donna?
Mr. Mayor, could I ask Peter, I was reading through the budget requests of some of the staff. If there's something there that we thought was a good idea and that we wanted to see it funded, but we didn't want it to go on the levy, is there a possibility that there will be reserve funds could be used for any of those suggestions that they had, their wish list?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, potentially yes, depending on what the project is as to if there's funds in the reserves that pertains to that.
That pertain to.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Is everybody kind of clear on where we're coming from on Wednesday, or where we're going to on Wednesday? All right. Yes, Councillor. Ask all you want.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Peter. Since we allowed for the retail cannabis to be in, and we know that there's going to be money coming in from that, has that been taken into consideration in the budget? Through
you, Mr. Mayor, no, because the fact is that right now we've received $13,000. That's basically going to go into reserve until such time as we know what we need to be doing, enforcement wise or whatnot. And those funds are would be earmarked specifically for the purpose of what the province is saying we can use those funds on. Any funds that come to us after that, which we have no idea what that's going to be, then those will have to obviously come back to council and have to decide through bylaw enforcement and like where are we spending that money.
Okay. Community safety is part of it, and so, but those will have to be earmarked to those. So even though we have the funds, they're technically in the budget as a reserve, but during the year we can, if there's a project that those can go to and we can fund it out of that, that's when we make that choice.
Okay, thanks.
It's not like you have to reopen the budget. Seeing nothing else, Councillor Danch. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry, yes. I have a mover and a seconder. I apologize. We have to go back. Councillor Desmarais and Councillor Beauregard had moved to receive this for information. All those in favor? Carried. Councillor Danch, motion to adjourn. Seconder, Councillor Beauregard. All in favor? Carried. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.